Here we go. Tonight we slip into the bleak, perilous, and absolutely not glamorous world of medieval assassins. Those silhouettes who slid through castle corridors and midnight alleys to nudge history with a blade and a breath. Movies make them look cool. The truth is that being a medieval assassin was miserable. Settle in, let the room go dim, let the fan hum, and ease into the story. One thing up front, nobody in the Middle Ages sprang out of bed saying, "I'd love to jab a noble for 12 silver and then hide in a barrel for 3 days." This wasn't a career ladder. It was the last rung after life kicked out all the others. The typical assassin wasn't a monastery-trained phantom or a mountaintop graduate in candlelit sword arts. More likely they were a desperate farmhand, a disgraced soldier, an ex-thief with steady hands, or someone so far below the radar that a murder wouldn't even dent the local gossip. If you had a title, a few acres, or even a half-decent goat, you hired people. If you had nothing but a reputation for solving problems and the ability to slide into a tavern without anyone clocking you, someone slid a purse across a table and whispered the name of a target who always had too many guards. Payment sounded sweet, reality tasted like rust. Half now, half later, if later, didn't turn into a knife in your ribs because dead contractors don't charge late fees. Some jobs were traps set by politics, decoy targets, backed by waiting soldiers with ropes already knotted, and even when the silver did land in your palm, it never matched the risk, the nights in itchy hay, the weeks of vanishing in crowds that smelled like smoke and onions, or the dawning realization that your client considered you a loose end the moment you succeeded. Training? There wasn't a syllabus, no guild orientation, no safety brief, no kindly mentor with a flute soundtrack. You learned by not dying the first time you tried. If you'd been in the army, you knew which end of the knife pointed outward. Otherwise, the mechanics of stabbing came faster than the art of escaping with your organs, which required either skill, luck, or a bribed stableboy who kept his mouth shut. Poison was a lecture in trial and error, with heavy emphasis on the latter. Sometimes your mark slumped, sometimes he burped, glared at his soup, and hired 2 more guards. Sometimes you mixed the cups wrong, there was no helpline, only herb lore, rumour, and a stomach that could handle tasting your own work. Gear was whatever you could steal, sharpen, and hide without jingling. No spring-loaded wrists, no smoke pellets, no collapsible crossbows tucked into boots. A decent dagger, bluntly shaped, hopefully not rancid with old blood. Maybe a garrote if you were ambitious, and a rope that pulled triple duty for climbing, tying, or panicking. Bows were fine until you remembered you were sneaking through a palace and archery equipment doesn't blend with the "I'm just a scullion" aesthetic. Most work happened within arm's reach, quick, quiet, and gone before anyone could sketch your jawline and nail it to a church door. Targets were never the sleepy turnip guy, they were barons, bishops, captains, sometimes royalty, the sort of people who slept behind locks, dined after tasters, and trusted exactly no one. First came the guards in rotating patterns you had to memorize like a hymn, then walls, gatehouses, moats, arrow slits, and architecture designed by people who woke up thinking, how can we make boiling oil part of our decor? Servants noticed strangers who couldn't carry a chamber pot without wincing, and gossip outran horses. Paranoia ruled at the centre. Your quarry might rotate bedrooms, use decoy beds, or stage midnight musical chairs with bolted doors. Feasts sounded helpful, everyone drunk, but all that did was add 50 witnesses, 3 dogs, and a jester with eyes like a hawk. Disguises were not wardrobe department chic. You looked like a malnourished goat herder with secrets, wearing a robe 2 sizes off and a belt that never sat right because a wrapped blade kept biting your hip. Masks mostly screamed plague victim, which clears space in a crowd but not at the door of a banquet. If cornered, you invented identities. Brother Tobias, specialist in silent prayer and rooftop maintenance. Stay in character too long and the cat in the kitchen will betray you by refusing to answer to its name when you guess wrong. You worked alone because company talked. Friends asked where the bruises came from and why you slept with a knife under your pillow. Lovers noticed blood that didn't smell like butcher's work. Other criminals kept their distance. Thieves are sociable until someone makes people disappear. At inns you chose the darkest corner, kept your back to the wall, drank lightly and moved at dawn. Names were rented, never owned. You vanished from every life you might have had. Failure wasn't a stern memo, it was a spectacle with ropes, wheels or iron that came with cheerful names and terrible uses. Missed the strike and the city locked down, gates slammed shut, sketches rolled out like wanted posters, and a guard named Thomas, fresh from a breakup, found a healthy outlet for his feelings. Sometimes your client turned executioner because a living witness is just a witness. There were no second tries. Perfection equaled survival. Anything less taught you how fast you could run in mud and chickens. Success wasn't a rooftop toast. It was sprinting through alleys with somebody's blood on your boots while dogs learned your scent. You had to pre-plan exits, disguises, ferrymen, and safe rooms because once the blade did its dull little miracle, you became a problem a city wanted solved by sundown. Clients evaporated, not because they weren't grateful, but because grateful people don't stay alive when the person who breached locked rooms is free and bored. You left with coins and a target pinned invisibly to your back. Add superstition to the bill. In an age where comets meant doom and unlucky breadloaves got blamed for plagues, an assassin wasn't just feared. He was rumoured to be cursed. Villagers imagined shape-shifting shadows, death whispers through walls, pacts with forest spirits. Carry a bundle of dried herbs and you're a sorcerer. Carry a blade and it must have been forged in a moonlit pit by someone with horns. Rumour helped you disappear until it didn't, and a priest rang a bell while farmers who'd waited their entire lives to hold a pitchfork finally got their chance. Poison promised elegance and delivered chaos. Without pure compounds or precise measuring, you eyeballed handfuls of plants and hoped the dog didn't test dinner before the steward did. Doses varied from a stomachache to a funeral, or tragically a faint embarrassment and a very angry noble. If they lived, they blamed the twitchy stranger who knew too much about mushrooms. If you were caught, you confessed to poisoning nearly everyone, including somehow the family pet. Even if you did something enormous, removed a tyrant, shifted a line of succession, no one remembered your name on purpose. Your client sought silence more than glory. You hoarded nothing, signed nothing, and were erased the way a draft disappears beneath clean parchment. If your name survived anywhere, it was inside a curse muttered by people who feared being next. And trust? That word belonged to poets. Clients denied everything, paid other killers to tidy up, or double-booked you with your own future murderer. Blackmail was confident and final. With luck, you got your money and a quiet life under a borrowed name in a village obsessed with rain and turnips. But even there you faced the knock on the door, the traveller who stared too long, the child who swore they'd seen you in another town. Retirement was a myth. Disappearance was the closest thing. So no, you probably wouldn't last. You'd arrive with movie expectations and leave with blisters, fleas, and an accelerated education in regret. The job offered a strange sort of power, access, surprise, a talent for vanishing, but no peace, no home, and no monuments. You didn't make history so much as cut a hidden groove into it and then slipped away before the ink dried. And yet history loves its shadows. It also loves queens who hissed back at the world. Before she became the most feared woman in Macedon, the future Olympias grew up in the rugged hills of Epirus, where people traced their blood to Achilles and stared at omens until the omens blinked. She wasn't an embroidery-by-the-window princess. She was a dancer in moonlit rites, a listener to prophecies, a keeper of serpents, literally or reputationally, depending on whether you trust terrified men with styluses. To some, she was touched by divinity. To others, she was a warning with jewellery. When Philip II reached Samothrace to taste sacred mysteries, he met a woman who didn't merely practice ritual, she radiated it. Their marriage fused politics to prophecy. Legends crackled around their wedding night. Thunderbolts, lions, flames that didn't burn. Out of that theatre came Alexander. Whether or not the gods signed his birth certificate, his mother moved as if they had. The palace at Pella was a nest of sharp smiles. Philip's appetite for alliances and wives didn't cool, and Olympias refused the background. She cultivated allies, consulted oracles, and carved a place for her son with the patience of a storm. At a notorious feast, a drunken general questioned Alexander's legitimacy. Did a god father him, or did scandal? The insult didn't weaken Olympias, it fed the myth. If whispers wanted divinity, she would make them a chorus. When Philip married a Macedonian-born wife named Cleopatra Eurydice, the stakes turned lethal. A local son could eclipse Alexander's claim. Olympias recognised that palaces were battlefields where mercy became a liability, and when Philip fell to an assassin at a royal wedding, the corridors echoed with a single question. Who? No one proved anything. Didn't matter. Within days, Cleopatra and her newborn were dead, and nothing stood between Alexander and the throne besides ceremonies and the frightened silence of people who remembered how snakes look when they decide to be still. Olympias was not delicate about power. She secured her son's crown with threats, coils of faith, and the surgical removal of rivals. Alexander might have winced at some of her methods and still relied on the result. an uncontested throne and a mother who kept the gods on speed prayer. When he marched east, she stayed in Macedon, writing letters that read like a blend of prophecy and political briefing. She admired victory, mistrusted old generals, and disliked foreign customs that made her son look less like the lion she'd promised and more like a peacock borrowing someone else's feathers. Antipater, the regent, bristled at her influence. She bristled back. Between them stretched miles, an empire, and the thread connecting a mother's certainty to a son's ambition. Then Babylon bled the light out of the world. Alexander died. The empire disassembled itself like furniture without instructions, and men with swords divvied up maps while practicing grave faces. Olympias pivoted to the only unbroken claim left, a child, Alexander IV, and his mother Roxana. In a world of generals with armies and grudges, a baby was both target and banner. Olympias made him a banner. She returned to Macedon with soldiers at her back, and cities opened their gates because myth, wielded properly, has weight. She punished those who had ruled in her absence, staged justice with chilly ceremony, and for a heartbeat held the kingdom she'd shaped from omens and steel. But Cassander, son of the man who had once kept her in check, came back cold and methodical. The siege of Pydna starved the legend to bone. Offers of safety came gilded with doubt. When hunger finally broke the garrison, Cassander didn't swing the sword himself. He handed her to the families of those she'd destroyed. Executioners hesitated. The mother of Alexander stood before them like a statue carved out of superstition and fury. So others were fetched, men with no memory of her greatness to cloud their orders. The blow fell. A dynasty's ember went dark, though the shadow of the Serpent Queen never left the stories told in rooms where ambitious people whisper. History shifts, but stone remembers. South on an island, the sun scours to brilliance, lies a place that feels less excavated than dreamt. The palace we call Knossos sprawls like organised confusion. Stairs to nowhere, corridors that double back, light wells, rooms upon rooms, like a thought you can't quite finish. Long before Athens glowed with marble and Sparta snarled, the Minoans built a civilization that seemed to prefer grace over gore. Fluid frescoes, dolphins, dancers, bulls leaping beneath steady hands. They traded across a bright sea rather than conquering by spear, and their architecture breathed. Air shafts cooled rooms, water coursed through clay pipes, apartments stacked with a confidence that didn't require walls to make them feel safe. We know them by the art they left and the puzzles they refused to solve. Their script, Linear A, remains unread, a locked door in a hallway that may never open. So we read their colours instead. Blue dolphins skating above tubs, women in flounced skirts, youths vaulting, a charging bull in a ritual theatre of risk and rhythm. Bullhorns flare from parapets in stylized stone, double axes, labriers glittered in shrines. Maybe the very word labyrinth is less about a maze and more about a house of the double axe. Perhaps the palace was never a prison for a monster so much as a temple for cycles and power, a sacred machine whose complexity inspired a myth that clung to its outline like ivy to stone. Centuries later, a British archaeologist with a talent for narrative peeled back the soil and decided this must be Minos' court. He labelled, restored with concrete where imagination ran faster than restraint, and gave Europe a look at a Bronze Age world that had slipped from memory. Critics argue about the reconstructions. The ruins don't argue back. They hum, walk the corridors, and you feel why people told stories. Because confusion breeds metaphor and awe demands a creature. Maybe the Minotaur was the palace itself, beautiful, baffling, impossible to understand in a straight line. No palace stays forever. Volcanoes roared, seas rose angry, trade shifted. Mainland powers arrived speaking Linear B. The art grew sterner. The gods tilted to different angles, and Knossos quieted without a dramatic pile of skeletons to photograph. It didn't fall in fire, it fell in sonnets. Time does what siege engines attempt. It pries, it leans, and then the walls are not there. Which brings us to the art of breaking walls before time does. The first battering rams were nothing but muscle and timber, men slamming living trees into fortifications with rhythm. Engineers learned to sheathe a swinging beam beneath a roof, to hang it on chains inside a wheeled frame, to turn impact into a profession. Assyrians carved their confidence into stone reliefs, engines grinding toward gates while arrows stitched the air. Greeks refined, Romans perfected, turning rams into predictable thunder. A stalled ram was a dead ram, a moving one made cities breathe shallow. Distance attacks rewrote fear. Torsion catapults stored wrath in twisted sinew and hair, launching stones or bolts with a hiss that ended in splintering wood. Later, the trebuchet, king of elegant terror, borrowed gravity and flung it back at you. Hoist the counterweight. Listen to the slow creak of inevitability. Watch the arms sweep and the sling release. Stones sailed in arcs that felt like judgment, sometimes pots of fire, sometimes something worse. Messages, heads, disease. A single colossal machine could humiliate a garrison before its first shot merely by existing within view. Height fought height. Siege towers rolled forward like wooden thunderheads, dripping wet hides against flame, bristling with archers. When the gangplank kissed a battlement, battle became a staircase you couldn't descend fast enough. And beneath all that, quieter and crueler engineers dug. Tunnels propped with timber, then burned, turned walls into sudden collapses. Defenders countermined, meeting enemies in caverns that turned into knife-bright, air-scarce nightmares. Defences answered with heat and secrecy. Greek fire clung to ships and skin, burning on water like an argument with physics. Oil poured through murder holes fitted itself to armoured joints before being lit. Hot sand hissed into gaps and cooked men inside their gear, without so much as a dramatic flame. Gravity remained the fortress's old friend. Stones tipping from parapets, logs rolling, bridges cracking at exactly the wrong moment for the person running across them. Siege warfare was as psychological as it was mechanical. Build your engines where they can see them. Test your throws in view of the walls. Let the rhythm of the ram drum itself into nightmare. Catapult payloads announced not just power, but contempt. The aim wasn't always to kill, it was to break the decision to resist. When will collapses came before masonry did, gates sometimes opened to save what could be saved. Gunpowder arrived and changed the timescale. Cannons did in a heartbeat what trebuchets did in an hour, and the proud geometry of medieval walls learned humility. Yet the logic stayed. Every artillery piece is a descendant of somebody's discovery that stored energy released in a guided direction can talk cities into surrender. The vocabulary of fear, creaking winch, rolling giant, sudden abundance before a shot hasn't left us. We merely translated it into new materials and longer ranges. We still surround. We still isolate. We still argue with the walls until they acquiesce. And somewhere in all this, threads cross. The assassin slipping through stairwells that twist. The queen writing destiny into letters and blood. The palace that became a myth because it refused to be legible. The engineers who turned physics into theatre. Each is a version of the same old human puzzle. How do you move through a world of obstacles when time will erase your name and stone will eventually soften? Some choose the blade, some the prophecy, some the plan, some the machine. All of them make an impression that fades, leaving behind a story that stubbornly refuses to end. So dim the lights again and listen for the hum. It's there in the alley where a footstep doesn't echo, in a letter scratched at midnight by a mother who believes gods listen, in a corridor that doubles back until you feel like you've walked into a metaphor, in the slow, majestic swing of an arm that flings a rock and a message at once. History isn't only what remains, it's also what slips away and keeps us awake, tracing threads through the dark. And if you lean closer, you can hear how the old patterns keep repeating, only the materials change. A wall becomes a network, a gate becomes a password, a moat becomes a tangle of laws or embargoes, and the slow pressure that starved castles into surrender turns into outages and silence that make a city feel suddenly far away from itself. The theatre persists too. Machines are assembled in view, countdowns run, demonstrations thunder, and people watching from behind their modern parapets measure resolve against the steady drum of inevitability. Shock and awe is just the trebuchet's arc scaled up and sped forward. The same lesson dressed in sparks instead of splinters. If you can break certainty, the stones will follow. Names still blur on purpose, and specialists finish grim work and then vanish into the folds of bureaucracy or the anonymity that protects both the employer and the employed. Somewhere a ledger records an outcome without noting the hands that nudged it, just as a medieval scribe once wrote, "A noble died and left the rest to rumour." Somewhere a city plan is drawn to confuse a newcomer's sense of straight lines because confusion buys precious seconds. The same logic that made Knossos feel like a riddle in stone. Somewhere a parent writes a letter to a child who believes they were born for largeness, and the letter says both yes and be careful in the same breath, because power still requires teeth and faith and the willingness to be misunderstood. If you want something closer, imagine a night no one wrote down. A provincial fortress breathes in the chill. A watchman counts heartbeats between torch flares. Outside, engineers finish a frame, hitch chains to a beam, and murmur about angles as if geometry were a prayer. The garrison can hear it, the low creak that feels like the first line of a story already decided. Somewhere beneath the wall, men with heavy lungs listen for the opposite crew's picks. When the sound comes, it arrives through soil like a rumour, distant, certain, getting louder. On the inner stair, a young soldier's palms sweat against a spear shaft. He's memorised the plan: hold the tower, douse the hides in oil, wait for the signal. But plans shrink in the presence of wood the size of a tree trunk swinging with intent. Above the gate, an officer decides when to pour, when to roll, when to let gravity do what it loves. Then the drum begins, and it is just physics arguing with stone while 200 heartbeats learn a new rhythm. Elsewhere in the same century, a man with the wrong kind of quiet face repeats 3 sentences in a borrowed accent and walks through a door that should have remained closed. He noticed the wobbly step 2 visits ago, learned which hallway sounds like water when it's still, and bribed the person who cares least about pride and most about bread. The moment always narrows to something simple: breath, weight, distance before exploding back into noise. If he succeeds, he joins the night wind and the stable smell, and the long road to somewhere his name has never been spoken. If he fails, he learns quickly how much an audience changes a performance. Either way, a page in a chronicle will say, "The Baron recovered," or "The Baron died," and someone will draw a line to war, to taxes, to a marriage, to a treaty. The hand that moved the line vanishes between the letters. Walk back through earlier ages and the pattern hums in different keys. Olympias writes to her son and folds the sheet with fingers that have held both infants and plots. Confident that intimacy with the divine is as practical a tool as a dagger when men are arguing over empires. She has learned the same rule the assassin knows. Trust is a story people tell to make themselves feel brave in the dark. She turns faith into architecture, rituals, alliances, stage justice, and builds a hallway her enemies cannot quite read. They will call it superstition or cruelty because that's what danger looks like when it wears a woman's face. Her victories arrive as if they were the weather. Her defeats arrive as if they were inevitable. Afterward, people argue about what she meant and whether the snakes were literal, while forgetting that literal isn't how power remembers itself. Beneath all this, a place like Knossos breathes. Light visits courtyards in measured sheets. Corridors fold and double. A staircase rises into sun as if the building enjoys small surprises. Bullhorns face the sky. A painted dolphin glides forever over plaster seas. The rooms seem to invite movement that isn't straight, like they were designed to teach you to turn the way a story turns. Someone will later insist there must have been a beast in the middle, because it's hard to accept that architecture alone can make you feel lost without malice. Someone else will chip away at letters none of us can read, convinced that when Linear A finally opens it will hand us a tidy legend. It won't. It will likely offer inventories, receipts, prayers in the voice of people delighted by rain or worried about grain. We will feel disappointed because we want doors to open into myths, not kitchens. But then we will realise that kitchens are where myths start: a stew, a song, a scuffle, a gift, a grief. And the disappointment will feel wrong in our mouths. Back at the wall, the ram's cadence changes from experiment to decision, and the wood answers with a sound that doesn't belong to wood anymore. Engineers love that moment. A structure telling the truth about itself. The defenders feel it in their ribs as much as in the gate. They pour, they drop, they shout, they pray, and for a while all 4 actions are the same action with different costumes. The tower lurches forward as if persuaded by its own momentum. A ladder shivers, a hand slips, a rock finds a shoulder that believed in luck. Somewhere a captain thinks about supply, disease, desertion, and calculates morale without numbers. Somewhere a soldier promises his god everything he has if he can have just one more morning. Somewhere an archer chooses a target and discovers how much the world narrows when you're the hinge on which someone else's story turns. Centuries later, the counterweight is replaced by powder, then by pressure and magnets and code. The arguments keep enlarging themselves. Trajectories stretch, flight times shrink, and yet the old questions stand in the doorway like patient relatives. How do you endure pressure? How do you confuse a rhythm? How do you keep believing while wood bends, while stone flakes, while orders arrive slower than fear? Manuals get thicker, ceremonies get shorter, uniforms change cut, but the human part doesn't innovate much. People still hesitate at the wrong instant and leap at the right one without knowing why. People still mistake quiet for safety and noise for certainty. People still think a new machine will make courage obsolete. It never does. If there's comfort here, and the sleepy kind of history always looks for it, it's in noticing that the shadows and the engines and the palaces and the letters were always bigger than the names attached to them. That's why the names blur. The assassin needed to vanish so the line he moved would remain. Olympias needed to terrify and then become a ghost so the boy she launched could become a map. Knossos needed to confuse so that Reverence could learn to walk instead of march. The ram, the catapult, the trebuchet, the tower, the tunnel each turned physics into a language that said the same sentence with different grammar. Persistence speaks. Defences replied with a sentence of their own. Attention survives. Between those two lines a lot of living happened. Meals, marriages, jokes, complaints about the smell of tallow, a child learning to skip, a baker watching the sky before dawn and deciding it looks like rain. Those remain too, in ways monuments can't manage. So breathe with the fan, let the room be small and kind, and let the long drum of old machines recede to the edge of hearing. Somewhere a fortress learns again that the most dangerous thing an attacker brings is patience. Somewhere a careful pair of feet counts floorboards and decides which ones don't creak. Somewhere a queen lights a lamp and writes by it until the oil is a thin glitter at the bottom of the cup. Somewhere a palace waits in warm dark earth and dreams about air shafts and sunlight. If you listen long enough, you can hear the thread unspool, not taut, not anxious, just steady, sliding through centuries, guiding you back out of the maze at whatever pace your breathing likes. The thread keeps paying out, steady as breath. And if you follow it a little farther, you find how ordinary the extraordinary always was. One winter night in a frontier town, the man everyone will later call an assassin is only a silhouette on a parapet counting the beats between a watchman's coughs. He timed it earlier with his own pulse. 8 heartbeats from the north corner to the gate tower, 6 back, a pause that means the man looks down to rub his fingers together, because the cold makes them numb. That pause is the opening. The assassin didn't arrive out of mist. He arrived by listening longer than anyone else thought useful. He wears a coarse cloak, not a legend, and his knife is wrapped in cloth to keep it from kissing metal. The plan is a straight line. Cross, climb, enter, end, but real knights tilt. Someone laughs at the wrong moment in the yard below. A mule shakes its head and the bell on its harness gives a soft, traitorous ring. He freezes with 1 foot over the lip of the wall, an awkward half step away from failure, then makes the kind of decision that divides stories. He steps back, breathes out, and waits through 3 patrol cycles to let the air forget him. That's the secret no ballad sings. Most survival is patience bored into bone. In the same city, a scribe is awake, copying a land grant by lamplight. He will be the one who records a noble died tomorrow, indifferent to methods because the law only cares about the vacancy. He adjusts the wick with a pin and leaves a wax dot in the margin that tells us, centuries later, he was tired. He knew nothing of knives or bribes or the particular hinge squeal on the second stair. He knew that names rotate through offices and that rents still come due. His small facts outlive the man on the wall, not because they are louder, but because they are filed. Move the thread to a shore where a queen mother leans over a letter and edits herself. Olympias writes in the voice of inevitability, but even inevitability has revisions. She scratches out a phrase too sharp to survive in a courier's pouch and replaces it with a sentence that looks like concern. She isn't softening. She's choosing the angle at which urgency will pierce a distant son whose advisors are learning to wrap him in silk and agreement. Her tools are belief and timing, and she handles both like steel. She knows that even in triumph a claim needs tending, like a flame that can gutter if the tent flap opens wrong. People will later call her monstrous because history loves condemning the woman who refused to leave power in a room full of men talking loudly. She will shrug in the only way she can, by winning until she can't. Far south, time opens a stairwell into daylight. Knossos warms and tourists shade their eyes against white stone where dolphins still swim on plaster seas. A guide says labyrinth in 3 languages and points to turns that fold upon themselves like careful lies. People smile because mazes are fun until they're not, and then quietly experience the small private jolt of being lost for half a minute in a building that can no longer hurt anyone. That jolt is why the story lasted. The place teaches a lesson without words. Complexity is not malice. Complexity is a choice. Someone designed this to make you turn. Someone else made a monster out of that feeling. Back at a wall in another century, an engineer rests a hand on the frame of a trebuchet and feels it talk back through vibration. Wood has opinions about load paths. Ropes speak when they stretch. The counterweight is a promise suspended on hinges of math and prayer. He and his crew watch the arm complete a test arc. They check pins, knots, the release angle. The best engineers in every age are patient pessimists. When the stone flies for real, it will be a sentence in a language everyone inside the city understands. It doesn't need translation, it needs repetition. A dozen arcs later, the parapet shows its first wound. Not dramatic, not cinematic. A corner flakes, dust drifts. You can hear morale move. Defenders answer with old wisdom disguised as quick thinking. Hide-wrapped bundles smoulder to throw smoke into sight lines. Buckets stand ready at murder holes, not because oil thrills them, but because heat changes minds faster than words. Someone has set aside a bag of sand that will not make a poem, but will save a life by finding the gap at a wrist and teaching the skin beneath to fear grains. The captain up top marks time differently from the engineer outside. He counts meals, water, quarrels among men, too long without sleep, and he keeps a ledger of jokes because a fortress that can't laugh cracks faster. He's not a hero, he's a caretaker of edges. Then there is the day the cannon comes, the first one they've seen. It looks ridiculous to someone raised on towers and slings, squat, heavy, and iron throat on a cart. The first shots are worse than expected. They land low, bite rashly into dirt. Men jeer because relief needs a sound. By afternoon the crew has learned the wind. The mouth lifts a fraction, the powder charge changes a spoonful, and a stone the size of a table chews a hole where no machine was supposed to chew. The jeers stop because new physics often arrives as a correction. Walls change shape in answer. Lower, thicker, angled into star points that make lines of fire cross like threads. Cities become geometry. A garrison learns to measure survival in ricochets. The engineer's grandchildren learn to diagram fields of fire with chalk in academies he never imagined. But even when the material changes, the talk stays old. Time, patience, pressure, fear, rumour, the ration of certainty to doubt, the vocabulary of siege. Replace the ram's drum with a fuse's hiss, the arc of stone with the bark of iron, and the argument stays the same. Will you keep believing while someone outside insists on teaching your wall a new language? We drift back into rooms where decisions look like ordinary posture. A taster pauses over a spoon. He is not brave, he is methodical. He smells, waits, dips, waits again. The kitchen listens to his breathing in a silence thick with steam. If he lives, nothing changes. If he does not, everything changes, and the assassin in a cloak in some corridor will discover how much a single cough near the high table compresses a plan. The jester notes faces. He is a security camera with bells. The stable boy remembers which visitors walk with city feet in country mud. The priest blesses a lock, not because God is a locksmith, but because the man behind the door sleeps better. A good door is worth a ritual. Anonymity moves through all of this like a useful ghost. The stone that brought down the tower got a nickname. The men on the ropes did not. The letter that swayed a general is preserved in a chest. The girl who smuggled it past a gate by pretending to limp has no grave marker. The tunnel that collapsed beneath the south wall is mapped by modern scholars. The miners who lit the brace timbers and ran coughing into dirt dark are unlisted. This isn't injustice so much as physics of attention. The big thing in the middle gets the light. But if you want to understand why anything happened, you tilt your lamp to the edges and count hands. And because the sleepy kind of history is honest, it makes room for the emptiness that follows noise. A city surrenders at dusk. The terms are read in a flat voice by a man who had hoped to be home by harvest. People emerge into air that feels both larger and smaller. The engines creak and settle. Soldiers lean against wheels and stare through one another. The captain of the wall writes 2 letters, one to a family in the town, one to a family far away, and these letters will never be in a museum because the recipients folded them into their lives until they became softness at the bottom of a chest. The assassin who had a job that night no longer has a job. He walks out of the city in the clothes of a porter, pushing a cart with 3 pans and a broken stool on it. An officer lets him pass because no one imagines a legend with a blister. Move the thread forward again and we are in a room full of maps. The walls are covered with lines that mean supply, lines that mean rumour, lines that mean no one is sure. A general asks a technician about weather, a technician asks a general about time. The clock answers both with numbers that feel neither kind nor cruel. The assault that follows is not a trebuchet's arc or a ram's thud, but a set of invisible pressures, signals that choke, lights that go out, doors that lock and won't unlock. It is still siege. Someone outside applies patient force, someone inside measures endurance. The arguments are quicker, but the sentences haven't changed. Meanwhile, the palace on Crete continues to unspool people through rooms that look like thoughts. Someone stops before the throne with griffins and asks whether a person sat there or an idea did. Another takes a photograph of a staircase that climbs into sun and doesn't notice they have captured a small candid miracle. Light travelling the same shaft it travelled when the plaster was fresh. The undeciphered script waits without apology. When we finally learn to read it, if we do, it will teach us modest things that matter. The receipts and the prayers will be neighbours on a tablet. We will hear a voice say, "We need more oil," and another say, "Bless the hands that bake." Between those, a civilization lives fully. We return once more to the quiet room where the fan hums. The story you were told tonight, the one that walked through knives and letters and walls and corridors that curve, was never about heroics. It was about method. It was about how power behaves when no one names it aloud. It was about how patience learns to wear different uniforms and how fear chooses whatever mask is handy. It was about why so many names erase themselves on purpose, because the work they did only works if no one can point to who did it. So if your eyes are heavy now, that's appropriate. These are heavy topics that travelled in soft shoes. Let the machines pack themselves away. Let the Queen's lamp go flat. Let the assassin fold his cloak into something less dramatic and more warm. Let the palace close its doors and keep its unanswered questions politely glowing behind plaster. The thread lies coiled within reach. When you need it again, you'll find it where you left it, simple as breath, strong as a promise, and long enough to lead you out of whatever maze you've wandered into without needing to run. The coil waits where you left it, and when you pick it up again, the path opens not into thunder, but into work. A wall isn't just a line on a landscape, it's the sum of hands. Picture a mason in early morning cool, tapping a chisel against limestone until the stone answers with the right sound. He isn't thinking about glory, he's thinking about angles, grain, and the way water will try to live inside tiny fractures come winter. He rounds an edge here, narrows a loophole there, leaves a shallow groove where a timber will sit because the timber will swell in rain and shrink in heat, and he wants the wall to forgive both. Years later, someone will measure that wall with envy or contempt, depending on whether they're inside or out. No one will ask the mason's name. The wall will, though. That's why it keeps standing. A carpenter lays planks for a tower floor and learns again that wood is not a servant. It's a partner that demands rhythm. He places cross-bracing with the modest swagger of someone who has kept men from falling by thinking 2 steps ahead of gravity. A rope maker sits in a workshop that smells like plant fibre and sweat and turns twist into strength. He tests each coil with his body and says nothing, because ropes that talk much on the ground will shriek under load. An armourer hammers out a lame's curve so it moves instead of pinching, not because he expects thanks, but because movement is the difference between a soldier who climbs and a soldier who curses. Whole chapters of history are written by people who solve 3-second problems with decade-long consequences. Follow the thread beneath the walls and you'll find a lantern guttering in a miner's hand. He's not romantic about Earth. He's alert to it. The tunnel breathes differently where the soil changes. You feel it against your face before the sound shifts. He listens for picks that are not his, counts by vibration, judges distance by how his teeth hum and not by how his ears insist. He props with timber, hates the way green wood complains, loves seasoned beams that hold their tongue, and carries a small bag of flour not for food, but to throw into the air to watch the dust hang. When it hangs wrong, there isn't enough air. When it hangs right, you still might not have enough time. He lights the braces when the signal comes and runs, the earth drops its shoulder, and the wall pretends to be a wave for one short, terrible second. Above, men shout about betrayal and brilliance. Below, lungs burn and someone calls a name no chronicle will remember. On the far side of years, in a quiet town where the loudest thing is a smith's bellows and gossip, a man with a forgettable profile sells herbs and tools. He has a stoop he doesn't need and a limp that comes and goes because memory should never be too precise. Children know him as the man who fixes pots and sharpens shears. Dogs know him as the man who smells like iron and mint. He sleeps with a dagger under a floorboard. He tells himself he keeps for thieves. He does not ask himself why the dagger is oiled so carefully. In the market he pauses it when someone laughs in a way that used to mean trouble, then remembers the laugh belongs to a baker with flour on his shoulder. He buys bread he doesn't want because buying something is a way of telling your heart to stand down. At night he listens to the door, to the window, to the 2 boards in the ceiling that creak when the wind comes from the west. He has become a weather vane with scars. One afternoon, a stranger's silhouette appears in the lane at the wrong time of day, a time when regular men are either at fields or at accounts. The silhouette hesitates, then asks for directions, the kind of question men carry like lanterns when they need to be seen. The man with herbs answers in a voice he invented years ago, and watches the stranger leave. Afterwards, he sits very still for a long while and discovers that sitting can be as tiring as running. Later, when he sharpens the town's knives, he throws in one cut that dulls his own a fraction more than necessary, a tax against old habits. We drift across water to a city that trains and on itself into geometry. Bastions angle like folded paper, moats widen and sink low, guns sit behind earth that doesn't shatter. The way stone does, fortification becomes a conversation with trigonometry. An engineer stands at a parapet scribbling triangles and muttering about plunging fire the way a baker mutters about steam. He doesn't love war, he loves correctness, lines that meet, arcs that match, trajectories that do what they're told. A town invests in him because mathematics, unlike promises, can be checked. When the siege comes, the first day looks like a proof on a chalked wall. By the 7th, the proof is damp, men cough, the ledger of powder shrinks, and correctness learns humility beside exhaustion. He adapts, which is the only polite way to say he improvises with fear biting his ankle. He discovers a satisfaction he will never confess, a placement so exact that a dead angle becomes a living defence. Precision is a kind of mercy. Anything that ends a fight sooner is a gift, even if it arrives wearing iron. Return to the palace that masqueraded as a maze, and listen to the chatter of things that don't talk. Lightwell say what they said 3,000 years ago. This is how you borrow sky. Staircases explain that vertical is not an enemy if you treat it with respect. The undeciphered tablets wait like closed eyelids in a cool room. When someone finally reads them, they will be intimate and practical. Jars counted, oil measured, a list of offerings with a stain where a thumb pressed too hard. Mixed in will be a scrap that sounds like a joke as old as laughter and exactly as fresh. We want thunderbolts, we get grocery lists written with holy care. That discovery will be the gift the place has always been trying to give. Ordinary life carries the weight you keep trying to hand to monsters. The Queen into Macedon keeps writing from beyond her time for anyone who can hear her tone. You can almost see her fingertip pause above the wax as she selects a word that will arrive like a needle beneath armour. There is nothing accidental in her piety. It is a schedule as much as a belief, and it places her in rooms she is not invited to enter. Her enemies say witch, because they need a word that explains why their certainties kept turning to sand. She is a ledger balanced in blood and prayer. You can dislike the arithmetic and still learn from the accounting. Back at the engines, there's a moment every crew knows and no one writes down because it isn't photogenic. The machine is ready. The order has not yet come. The world narrows to small sounds. Hemp fibres easing, wood settling, a man clearing his throat twice because once is accident and twice is nerves. It's the pause before translation. Potential into force. Plan into debris. Threat into fact. In that pause, someone always thinks about home, and someone else thinks about accuracy. And someone thinks nothing at all because emptiness is easier to carry into noise. Then the arm swings and thought rides with the stone or stays behind on the platform, and either way is irrelevant. The wall will answer. The wall always answers. Sometimes it says not here, sometimes it says not yet, sometimes it says yes. Inside, defenders pass buckets and jokes like heirlooms. A young soldier learns to distinguish the boom that means near from the boom that means impressive but harmless. He is wrong at least once. A cook ladles thin stew and sneaks an extra spoonful to the man who keeps the gate gear oiled, because she has watched how often gates save lives in stories and in cities. A priest drones a blessing even he half doubts. The blessing is for the men, not the god, and the god, if he is kind, understands this. A woman mends a sleeve with thread that doesn't match because the point is to stop tearing, not to be admired. A boy counts the time between shots and boasts about his guesses because guesses feel like control. Elsewhere, the work of shadow continues at a smaller scale and an older pace. A messenger memorises a letter and burns the paper because words carried in a skull can't be confiscated by a guard with a lantern. He repeats the phrasing in his head until it becomes a tune. When he delivers it, he forgets it on purpose. A clerk adjusts 2 numbers so an extra cart of grain can vanish in the right direction, and he presses his lips together in a way that tells you he doesn't trust his life to silence, only to anonymity. In a workshop, a woman mixes herbs and ash the way her grandmother taught her. Not for poison, not tonight, but for salve. Because in every siege there are more raw hands than glorious wounds. The thread loops through quieter years where the engines rot into museum pieces and the knives turn into heirlooms with stories attached that are 40% true. A guide in a keep tells one version of events because that's the one that fits into an hour and ends clean. A child hears the clean ending and grows up to find out there weren't clean endings, only pauses, and that knowledge makes them kinder, which is not nothing. A scholar prints a diagram of a trebuchet and tapes it above a desk to remind themselves that elegant solutions also creak and must be checked twice. An old man who once sold herbs forgets why he's careful, and becomes careful anyway, which is its own kind of salvation. If you tilt the coil of thread in your hands, you see thin glints where it caught on nails and teeth and the edges of decisions. That's how you know it's the real one and not a souvenir. You can tug it forward again if you like. There are always more rooms, more ramps, more letters, more patient machines and impatient hearts, or you can let it rest. The walls will keep arguing with whatever century we build at them. The palaces will continue to ask their beautiful, inconvenient questions. The queens will keep writing to sons who think themselves immune to advice until they aren't. The assassins will keep walking away from their names. The masons will keep tapping stone until it answers yes. And you, because you've learned how to listen for the rhythm that lives beneath spectacle, can set the thread down on the bedside table and know it will be waiting in the morning exactly where you left it, ready to lead you in or lead you out with the simple confidence of string. If you lift the string again, it catches on one more set of lives that held the loud events together without ever being named. In a town girded for a long stand, the quartermaster learns that victory is measured in chalk. How many sacks, how many days, how many men, how many mules whose patience outlasts tempers. He becomes fluent in the slow arithmetic of endurance. Water first, salt next, firewood always, vinegar, if you can get it, because clean barrels save more lives than brave speeches. He writes numbers that feel small and knows they are enormous. A wall falls quickest when the ledger fails. Across the field a scout kneels to read the ground as if it had handwriting. He notices crushed fennel near a ditch and decides a cart came through at dawn, heavy and listing to the left because one wheel leaves a deeper groove. He breathes the air and finds iron in it, a hint that engines have been moved, or that a blacksmith's yard has been very busy. He returns with no trophies, just a paragraph of observations that will turn into a plan someone else will take credit for. Later, when the trebuchet speaks and the wall answers, he feels the same odd satisfaction as the engineer. The world admitted what it was. A bell rings in a distant cloister and the monks file into the scriptorium, sleeves rolled, knives sharp, inks mixed, each page an act of pact-making with memory. One sets down a chronicle that will survive fire and seas, noting a siege with 3 lines and an invasion with 2. In the margin he draws a tiny ram with wheels because men who copy empires are still allowed to be human. Centuries later, a scholar will smile at that ram and feel the room get warmer. The monk had chapped hands and a sense of humour. That knowledge is its own kind of victory over silence. Somewhere between walls and palaces, a road learns how to carry more than feet. Couriers teach fresh horses to accept foam-flecked riders in the dark. Post houses put lamps in windows like promises. A message can outrun catastrophe for a while, if you give it a change of mount and bread wedged in a saddlebag. A general learns to speak in distances. 1 day to the river, 2 to the hills, 3 if the ford is swollen. When he's wrong, men go hungry. When he's right, the battle he avoids is the bravest one. He'll never be thanked for not fighting. And because the world keeps folding motives into places, step back into Knossos and follow a child through its turns. She keeps one hand to the wall the way her grandmother taught her, just so, and never quite loses herself because the trick to mazes isn't cleverness, it's composure. She stops in a room where a painted cat stalks a bird and names the cat after an aunt who laughs loudly. She grows up to be someone who can hold 2 thoughts at once, that beauty can be complicated without being cruel, and that some confusions are invitations, not traps. When she is old, she will walk the same corridors and be surprised to find they are smaller than the stories in her head, which is how you know the stories worked. Back to the queen whose letters went farther than her feet. Imagine one last message written at a desk scraped thin by sleepless elbows. She measures her words to pierce precisely the armour of a man now more myth than sun, and chooses mercy as an edge, because mercy, properly sharpened, is terrifying. It promises nothing and offers everything at the same time. She seals the letter in wax stamped with a serpent and passes it to a woman who will take the long road because the short one is watched. If that woman reaches the right hand at the right hour, A regiment turns, a city is spared, a boy lives to learn his letters. If she does not, the map changes by an inch and the century shifts a degree. History often hinges on errands we would call favours if we knew the names of the people who ran them. Less dramatic, but as decisive. A baker wakes before dawn and decides to stretch flour with barley instead of sawdust because he is tired of funerals. He is not a hero, he is stubborn about bread. The morning he chooses barley, a captain eats something that strengthens rather than weakens, and at noon he makes a clever decision instead of a desperate one. In the ledger of causes, the line for bread is longer than the line for glory, but no one reads that book at parades. On the assault field, the old machines come to share a last conversation with the new. A ram shudders to a halt near a gate more modern than it is. A cannon on a low earthwork stares down a tower that once felt invincible. The crews exchange the same glances across centuries. We are doing dangerous work carefully. The uniforms change, the checks do not. Pin, knot, powder, few. Then the moment when all the lists end and you find out whether you counted correctly. At that moment a superstition flits through every age's mind. A touch to a charm, a word under the breath, a glance skyward. Engineers deny it, soldiers don't bother. The wall does not care, but the hands do, and hands hold the world together more reliably than hearts or flags. Under the ground again, 2 tunnels approach. One crew is better with shoring, the other faster at moving spoil. They meet not with a clash of armies, but with the shock of 2 lamplights colliding in a puddle. For a second everyone blinks, then the world narrows to breath and blade in a room the size of a wagon. There is no spectacle to it, only outcome, and afterward, each side tells a story that becomes truer with each telling because memory loves a clean line. The dirt retains a more honest version, smeared, confused, equal parts courage and luck. And because some nights refuse drama entirely, the assassin who used to be someone else stands in a doorway while rain speaks the same sentence on a roof and road. He looks out at nothing in particular and feels his body loosen, as if the rain has remembered his name for him. A wagon rattles past. A woman argues lovingly with a stubborn goat. A child sings nonsense while hopping over puddles. The man lets the room grow dark behind him, because darkness is a friend if you invite it rather than fear it. He goes to bed early and sleeps almost through, waking only once when a branch taps the shutter exactly like a knuckle. He smiles at himself in the dark and falls back under. We take one more turn through the siege lines to listen for the sound that matters most, the one that says it's over. It is often a soft sound. Keys, gates opening, not with triumph but with relief. Boots that scrape differently when men are done pretending to be larger than they are. A sob someone does not mean to let escape because survival feels heavier up close. The engines are quiet. The ropes look like tired snakes. The frames become scaffolds for a different task. Repairs, rebuilding, the architecture of afterward. Both sides have lists again. Nails, beams, lime, grain. The common nouns say what the trumpets can't. In the palace where the dolphins swim forever, evening visitors drift out and a custodian locks a door with a gentleness that suggests affection. He pats the wood as if it were an old friend and whistles something his grandmother liked to hum while shelling beans. A wind rises off the hills and threads the light wells with a sound that must have existed when there were more voices here and fewer questions. The place keeps its counsel without malice. Tomorrow it will offer the same gift, room to wonder without demanding an answer. And if you need one more scene to settle the mind, return to the scriptorium where the monk who drew the little ram pauses, flexes his ink-stained fingers, and writes a line that is not quite in the rules. And yet the people kept walking. It's not commentary, it's observation. The people at the walls, the people under them, the people between, assassins, queens, masons, engineers, cooks, couriers, jesters, priests, children, and the rest, kept walking. Through corridors and fields, through plans and mistakes, through nights that asked more than days could answer, through myths and markets, through fear and fatigue. That's the plainest truth hiding beneath the theatre of history. We kept walking. So let the fan hum and the room dim until shapes blur into kindness. The thread is back on the table where it belongs, its small shine a promise rather than a demand. It will be there when you want it, forgiving of pauses, indifferent to hurry, happy to run through your fingers one more time and guide you, gently, steadily, past knives and letters, towers and corridors, into sleep or into morning, whichever arrives first. Pick up the thread and feel how it pulls you through scenes that seem small until you tilt them. A hilltop town leans into a dawn that smells of damp stone and smoke. The bell for the first prayer is late because the monk who rings it is watching cloud shadows climb the opposite slope as if news had taken a visible form. On the parapet, a sentry traces a line on the horizon with a finger. Not because he sees anything yet, but because drawing an invisible boundary with your body is a way to teach your mind where danger will show itself. In the yard below, a woman empties ash from last night's stove into a bucket and scolds a hen with the confidence of someone who has put more meals on tables than any general ever will. If you asked her what keeps a city alive, she would say, water and a habit. She would be right. Across the valley, an engine crew starts their day with the same ritual that has kept them out of trouble since the first frame was lashed together. Hands on wood, eyes on knots, a quick word half to one another and half to the machine because tools behave better when you treat them like partners. The foreman lifts the pin, the arm floats, a junior man flinches and then smiles at himself. Fear is a useful animal when you feed it discipline. They walk through their checks. The rope smells like rain and old sweat. The sling is smooth where stone has polished it. The counterweight sulks with the heavy patience of gravity waiting to be introduced to a wall. Inside the city, a captain draws a diagram in dust with the butt of a spear. He points out where the first breach will try to open, where a second subtler attack will pretend to be the first, and where he wants water staged because nothing ruins courage like smoke in the lungs and heat at the wrist. The men nod, not because they agree with every arrow he draws, but because attention is contagious and they are catching it. He cracks a joke so poor it loops back into funny. A ripple of laughter loosens shoulders. Somewhere a boy takes that laugh and stores it for the hour when he'll need to borrow calm. Further back, where walls turn into warehouses and warehouses into home, a ledger is being honest. The quartermaster, who measures victory in spoons of salt and lengths of wick, runs a finger down columns that tell a simpler truth than speeches ever manage. 3 days of decent bread, 5 if you stretch, vinegar low, barrel staves good, lamp oil middling, arrows fine if no one panics. He rubs his eyes and writes 2 letters, one to exhort, one to beg, then tears up the exhortation because men cannot eat paragraphs. On the road that ties towns to each other like beads on a string, a courier changes horses with a smoothness that looks like grace and is really practice. He drinks water that tastes a little like leather and a little like iron and doesn't notice because what matters is that it's wet. He carries a message not on paper but in order, a rhythm of phrases he has memorized so thoroughly they feel like a song he's tired of and still loves. He hums it under his breath to keep its edges sharp. The post-house matron hands him a heel of bread and a pinch of salt without asking questions because a functioning road is a kind of peace treaty. In a narrower corridor than pride would choose, a man who used to be an occupation rather than a person waits until fearful gets him. He has learned that the most violent thing in his trade is restraint. A guard coughs on the stair. A second footstep fails to follow the first. The waiting man changes the order of his plan by 2 heartbeats and widens his odds by a season. And if the night passes without a chance, he leaves, because survival often looks like refusing the scene you imagined for the one the world offers. The palace on the island breathes through its light wells as it has always done, ignoring the modern argument around it about which wall is original and which is a well-meaning dream in concrete. A guide mentions the undeciphered script and a child asks if the tablets are shy, which is the best theory put forward so far. In a storeroom, a shard of painted plaster shows a hand holding a lily, and for a moment you understand an entire civilization without needing to read its words. They had time for flowers, and that time was not frivolous, it was policy. At a frontier fort with angles like folded stars, an engineer traces invisible arcs through cold air and finds where plunging fire will intersect a slope of earth. He whispers numbers, because saying them makes them behave. He has read old books that speak in Latin about new realities and is pleased by the way geometry does not choose sides. When the first canon speaks, he flinches and then grins despite himself. There is a music to competent violence that he dislikes respecting. Inside the town, the captain hears the same note and files it under problems that can be managed rather than miracles that can't. Under the ground where panic goes to practice, 2 teams of diggers pause to listen. Breath catches dirt, lamps nibble air, picks resume in a rhythm that sounds like rain that forgot how to be gentle. One crew salts the supports with resin, because they have a plan for later. The other packs wet cloth around timbers because they have a plan for now. They will meet by accident like half-remembered cousins at a market. What happens there will be told as heroism by one side and treachery by the other. The earth will keep a quieter version, constraint and chance. On the rampart, a jester jingles at the wrong time and saves a life because a laughing crowd looks in the direction he's standing and in looking sees the ladder no one meant to notice. He pretends it was on purpose. He will pretend many things on purpose before the day ends, because pretense is one of the few tools that works on both fear and pride. Down by the gate, the woman with the stew pot changes where she stands, so a man whose hands shake has to pass her on his way to the wall. She will ask him about his sister's baby. He will tell her, and in telling, he will remember that he is a person built of more than powder and orders. When the city finally folds, it is sunset, and the sound is not triumph but keys. Men step through a gate at a pace that acknowledges exhaustion without collapsing into it. A drummer who has held the same beat for 10 hours puts down the sticks and discovers that his hands have been negotiating with pain without his signature. The engines stand like tired oxen. Someone strokes a beam the way you do an animal that has worked hard and been decent. Terms are read. Someone cries, trying not to. Someone else calculates how many boards it will take to close the breach before rain turns victory into mildew. In the days after, work doubles and glory quits the field. A carpenter teaches an apprentice how to make a joint that forgives weather. A mason patches with lime that will cure slowly and beautifully if people can resist touching it for too long, which they will not. Children find a metal shard and turn it into a toy boat's keel, because repurposing is how trauma pretends to be thrift. The quartermaster's numbers deflate into normalcy: bread, salt, oil, sleep. And that is what winning looks like from inside, lists that stop screaming. Far away and long before, a royal mother dips a stylus and decides that this last sentence will be a blessing disguised as instruction. She chooses a word that means both hold fast and be kind in the dialect that her son's soldiers understand, but his courtiers do not. When the letter is read in a tent that smells like sweat and maps, a man who has not wept since he was 10 lifts a hand to his face as if a fly had bothered him. Orders are modified by an inch. A city is spared the kind of lesson that takes generations to forget. No one attributes this to a woman with snakes in the margins of her reputation. That is fine with her. She believed in results. Back in the excavated palace, a janitor sweeps dust from a threshold that has known more feet than the century knows names. He hums a tune his grandfather hummed while mending nets. A pair of tourists argue softly about whether the labyrinth was real. The janitor thinks about pipes that still drain when it rains, and decides the real miracle is that water knows where to go. He locks up with a caress, because doors remember touch as much as hinges remember oil. And here, where the fan hums and the thread lies on your table like something both ancient and domestic, the lesson shrugs into view without asking to be called wise. The world runs on patience disguised as routine. Walls are made of hands, engines are made of doubt checked and checked again. Letters move maps by inches that feel like miles later. Palaces become myths because confusion is fertile. Queens are called monsters when they refuse to make themselves smaller for other people's comfort. Assassins become weather, and then wool and fog. Bread is policy, water is victory, attention is survival, and afterward, the part no chronicle lingers over because it sells fewer copies, people sweep, mend, stack, stir, sleep, wake, and sweep again. If you want to keep walking, the thread will not mind. It is long and it is merciful, and it leads with the sort of confidence that never raises its voice. But if the night has grown heavy and your eyes have learned the trick of soft focus, set the string down. The machines will put themselves to bed. The letters will fold their edges flat. The palace will exhale into cool stone. The gate will decide the day is over and act accordingly. Somewhere a hen argues with the inevitable and loses. Somewhere a man laughs too loudly and is forgiven. Somewhere a child dreams of a dolphin that swims through walls. And you, who have followed far enough to hear how quiet carries the weight of history better than noise does, can let the room dim the rest of the way and trust that the path will still be there in the morning, uncomplicated as light. Lift the thread and it runs through a workshop where ordinary skill keeps catastrophe at arm's length. A fletcher turns shafts beneath a blunt knife and checks straightness against his eye, because a line truer than string lives between fingertip and stare. He glues feathers with a smear that looks careless and is exact, then binds, then tests the pull of a bow with a respect that skirts superstition. He knows what the soldiers will forget in the first rush. Arrows are arguments with air, and air always answers. Across the lane, a tanner rinses hides in clean water he hoarded from last week's storm, then oils them into straps that won't split in the first hard rain. Somewhere between those hands, a siege gains or loses a day. In the counting house beside the gate, a woman aligns pebbles on a tray to model rations. 5 pebbles for flour, 3 for salt, 1 for vinegar, 2 for pulses if the merchant keeps his word. She moves a pebble from one bowl to another as if the stone had weight beyond itself, and it does. It stands for meals not eaten today so that there will be meals 3 days hence. When the captain asks what spirit sustains the city, she points to the tray. Faith runs on food. A messenger slips through a postern at grey light. He wears dust and a face that reveals nothing, which is the only face that survives long in a war of small distances. The guard on duty checks the knot on the messenger's belt instead of the signet on his hand. Knots tell truth to people who have practiced. Satisfied, he lets him through. The messenger will deliver nothing dramatic, only distances, numbers, and a suggested hour for lighting tar at the south wall. Those details will save more lives than any shout of courage this week. Near the southern bastion, a boy tasked with fetching water learns the city's geography by thirst. Which cistern tastes of iron, which well shifts flavour after rain, which bucket needs a new handle because the old one bites palms. He runs with more eagerness than caution and drips half his prize onto stone. An old woman meets him halfway and shows him the trick. Lower the bucket slow, lift steady, never rush surface to air. He remembers because instruction felt like kindness, and kindness sticks. Out where the field darkens in footprints, a crew adds a skin of fresh hide to the ram's roof. They do it without speech because talk invites mistakes when hands are near knives and wet leather. The foreman claps once when the last peg sits, not for applause, but to mark the transition from making to using. He looks toward the gate not with anger, but with comprehension. Wood longs for work, stone longs to be still, men stand between and negotiate. Inside the palace that learned how to be a myth, a conservator kneels over a shard and breathes less than habit. A brush teases dust from a flower that has outlived 100 winters. Pigment brightens just enough to prove itself. She notes the layer in a book whose careful numbers honour the fact that this beauty was once logistics. Who mixed lime, who carried water, who set scaffold, who paid in oil, who brought bread to the scaffolders at noon. She will never meet those workers. She refuses to make them ghosts. When she locks the case at night, she touches the glass as one artisan greeting another across an honest distance. A letter moves across a continent in stages. In one village, an innkeeper warms wax next to soup and watches the seal impressed by a ring that passed through too many hands to be a secret anymore. He says nothing. In a pass where snow lingers even after spring has been generous elsewhere, a mule balks and is coaxed forward with a word that mules value more than a stick: steady. In a wide valley, a ferryman takes the letter in a tin box because river water respects tin more than paper. At last, the letter reaches a tent where a man smells of iron and sleep. He reads a sentence that fuses pride to prudence and folds the parchment as if closing a wound. In the morning, he says, "We wait 2 days, and his mages think he has had a vision. He has had a letter. Under earth, the mineshaft wakes to labour. Timbers creak, a language anyone who digs learns by heart. A man with a scar under his eye tests the roof with the flat of his hand and trusts the vibration more than he trusts the lamp's polite light. He draws a thumb across a support and feels resin. The other side salted their braces to burn hot. He smiles without humour. They're smart, he says, and sets a second row of chocks because respect for an enemy you cannot see is the most economical kind of caution. On a wall scribed into stars and angles, an engineer places a hand on packed earth and thinks about degrees instead of honour. He likes that mathematics refuses flattery. His second wiggles a stake in the glacis and says, "Good," with the quiet satisfaction of craft. When a ball strikes and thuds into the face of the bastion, the engineer notes the scar and changes the next placement by a hair. The hair matters. Later, when the smoke clears, the wall looks less impressive than the conversation that kept it standing. Angle, distance, depth, time. The assassin who learned to be a shopkeeper spends a whole morning repairing a kettle and feels useful in a way that steals from his old skill without asking permission. The woman who brings the kettle gives him a peach as thanks, and he bites it slowly because peaches teach patience even to men who have too much of it already. Juice runs into his beard. He laughs and does not check the door. For the length of a peach, he is a person unobserved by fate. Afterward, he cleans the knife very carefully, less for the blade's sake than for the ritual of finishing something without running. In a cramped chamber off a corridor painted with dolphins, a child tucks a scrap of paper behind a stone and tells herself it's an offering. She writes one word on it because she cannot yet write two: stay. She does not know she is speaking to centuries. The paper will vanish, the habit will not. When she is grown and someone asks how she kept her balance, she will shrug and say she put small wishes in small places and let the world decide. We tilt back to siege lines where a modest miracle happens unnoticed by the chronicler and indispensable to the outcome. A rope does not snap. It had every right to. Old fibre, damp air, too much load. But the lay was true. The splice clean. The strain within sense. And the men on the winches felt the give early and eased without needing to be told. The stone flies when it should, not before, not after, and lands where the wall has already learned to fear landing. No one cheers. They simply do it again. Competence is the quietest thunder. On the wall, a man who has been brave too many times in one day leans his forehead against cold stone and finds more comfort in that than he has ever found in speeches. He thinks, not for the first time, of leaving. He also thinks, not for the first time, of the child who counts the cadence of the drums and laughs when she guesses right. He goes back to his place. On the field, a woman who has carried water until her shoulders argue with the sky lies flat for 3 breaths behind a cartwheel and discovers that humility feels like relief, not defeat. She gets up and carries again. These are not dramatic gestures. They are the architecture of survival. At dusk, the city coins a treaty out of breath, standards lower, gates open, terms read. Hands shake without liking one another. A carpenter walks the broken edge of the breach and measures with his foot because tape lies and feet do not. He whistles the kind of tune that decides whether a job is 1 day or 2. A cook sets aside a portion for men who used to throw stones at her friends because hunger remains hunger, even when uniforms change. The priest who blessed locks yesterday blesses shovels today. He believes more in shovels than in locks. Far away, a scholar who has never seen a siege listens to a lecture about water management in Bronze Age palaces and takes notes with the kind of attention that honours both the dead and the living. She draws a little diagram of a light well and writes beside it, "Borrow sky to cool stone." Later, when life expects strength from her at an hour she didn't choose, she will remember that line and open a window. This is how history does its best work, by offering metaphors you can use with your hands. Back in the shop where the man keeps herbs to cover the smell of oil, a customer asks for a blade to cut cordage and he reaches, automatically, for a shape meant for flesh. He stops, smiles, and hands over a hook knife that will never invite an old habit to wake. "This will do," he says, and here's how often those words have rescued people from worse sentences. When the door closes, he opens a drawer and takes out a coin he has not spent, the first coin anyone ever paid him for that other work. He looks at it until it stops being heavy and becomes only metal, then tucks it back and goes to wash his hands. In a city rebuilt on old foundations, a mason hacks at mortared rubble until he finds the seam where yesterday ends and today begins. He lays a new course that will outlast his name and whistles so his apprentice hears that work without swagger still sings. 2 streets over, a child draws a ram with wheels in dust and insists the horns are necessary because horns mean animal, and animal means alive, and alive means interesting. Her grandmother laughs and lets the horn stand. Accuracy will come later. Delight comes first. The palace closes to evening. The custodian checks latches and murmurs, "Good night," to rooms that answer with the same cool breath they have had since before any alphabet wore the right shape for their stories. A wind moves down stairwells. The dolphins keep swimming. The undeciphered tablets wait without impatience, uninterested in whether we find the key. They hold both shopping lists and prayers. They are content with that balance. Tomorrow someone will press a hand to the warm stone and feel with pleasant surprise that it feels like stone. Myths, after all, live in people. Buildings are honest. Here, the fan hums and the thread lies easy. You can follow it again if you want, to new engines, new letters, new kitchens, new walls, or you can let it rest and trust that nothing urgent will vanish while you sleep. The world will keep doing what it has always done. Move stones, carry water, write sentences that change maps by inches, misname ruthless women and then depend on them, misremember anonymous men and then be saved by them, ask buildings to hold stories they were never designed to carry. Learn the hard way that bread is strategy and patience is armour. When morning comes, light will reach through whatever window you give it and make a simple promise: the path is where you left it. The thread is strong enough. Your steps will remember. The thread runs on into an evening where the sky folds itself into layers of blue and ash, a quiet that isn't peace so much as a pause, where people remember how to use their hands for something besides bracing. A smith sits on his threshold and files the last burr from a hinge he promised before dawn, a promise made to a door that's held in more worries than wind. He likes doors because they make sense. Swing, seat, latch, stay, he wishes men did the same. Across the lane, a candlemaker trims wicks with the neat severity of someone who understands how small flames misbehave. If you asked her about strategy, she'd talk about smoke and soot, about how a room breathes better when light is calibrated rather than simply lit. Outside the walls, a siege park sighs into evening. A boy running messages for the engineers trips, recovers, and pretends the stumble was a planned curve. He knows the smell of rope after rain and the difference between oak and ash by the way they complain under load. He will grow up to be someone who can tell when a plan is good by the sound tools make in their idle moments. Quiet has timbre, trust learns it. In a narrow room where the stone sweats when fog comes in from the river, a woman copies a map by heart. The original is too valuable to risk. The copy must be good enough to save lives without being good enough to betray them if taken. She sketches the bend where wagons tip if they're overloaded, and draws a tiny X where one rock carefully rolled has solved more problems than speeches. She leaves the ridgelines a shade heavier than the streams because men who get thirsty forget which line means water. Then she folds the copy and stitches it into a shirt cuff. The seam looks clumsy. People do not search clumsy seams. On a parapet, a soldier counts constellations as if tallying friends. He doesn't know their names, he gives them his own. One cluster becomes his mother's kitchen shelf. A bright pair become his cousins who always arrived with trouble and left with bread. He finds comfort in that private scenery. It is newer than the one in ancient books and exactly as true. The shopkeeper who used to be a knife imagines for a disloyal moment a different life entirely. A vineyard, a dog who behaves, a friend who tells jokes slowly and laughs too soon. Then a customer asks for a hook to lift hot lids, and he demonstrates a trick with tongs that keeps the back of a hand safe. The lesson is absorbed, the coin is warm, the wish is dismissed, not because it is foolish, but because it is unneeded. He has enough. Work, a lock that answers softly, a window that elopes with mornings. Wishing is for emergencies. Tonight is ordinary. Ordinary is rare. In a courtyard where plaster remembers blue oceans, a guide closes a gate and lingers. She has learned to time the long shadow that slides down a stair at dusk. It arrives like a certainty. She listens to wind navigate the light wells, a sound that doesn't belong to any one century. Her grandmother believed the labyrinth was inside the palace. Her professor believed it was inside the mind. She believes both and neither. What she knows is that people breathe differently in these corridors, and breathing changes what you think you want. She has seen tourists decide to forgive someone while tracing a painted dolphin with their eyes. Architecture as amnesty. She doesn't tell that to groups. It sounds sentimental in daylight. At dusk, it sounds like instruction. A captain who has survived enough to distrust adjectives sits with his boots off and rubs a bruise earned from a ladder he didn't climb fast enough. He writes a note to the quartermaster that says only, water, salt, oil, sleep. He doesn't add please because need outranks politeness. He does add thanks because he prefers to live in a world where gratitude is not a casualty. Then he mends a strap with thread that doesn't match and decides the mismatch will remind him to check it more often. Inelegance as alarm. At a monastery where winter keeps a room even in spring, a novice turns a page with 2 fingers and whispers, titles of kings he does not admire. He has been told to preserve. He is learning how to understand. In the margin he draws nothing, although he wants to. A tiny fish, perhaps, to mark the line where bread was rationed fairly during a siege, his abbot claims never happened. He decides to rebel later, amiably, by misshelving a dull chronicle so that a livelier one is discovered by accident. Curation as mercy. In a field scarred with wheel ruts, a siege tower waits like a great ox lunging in dreams. The crew sleeps shallow, the way hands sleep when tomorrow matters. One man rests his palm on a wheel spoke as if the machine might roll away without permission. He dreams of rain on tarpaulins, of flame that refuses to learn its lines, of enemy arrows that arrive late, confused. When he wakes, he feels rested enough to be precise. Precision is sleep's oddest gift. On a street where a market rehearses itself for morning, a baker leans with his back against a cooling oven and counts. He counts loaves, yes, but also decisions. Who gets the first? Who gets the almost burnt? Who needs a gift disguised as a mistake? Who will pay tomorrow because their father always did until last month? He writes nothing down. Debt is a mathematics of character. Paper insults it. When a stray dog sleeps outside his door, he spills water into a shallow bowl and tells himself it is for the cat he does not own, because mercy is easier to repeat when you give it a name that doesn't sound like a sermon. At the south gate, a girl chalks a hopscotch grid where boots will erase it by noon. She knows this and plays anyway, as if teaching the street to remember a lighter rhythm beneath the heavy one. Her mother watches from a window and stitches a hem that will not be noticed because success in sewing, like success in defence, is invisibility. When the chalk vanishes, the Bell girl draw it again. Persistence is a child's first discipline, chalk is cheap. Far from walls, on a road whose ditches currently host frogs and future arguments, a courier pauses where a shrine leans. He leaves a sprig of rosemary, not because he believes exactly, but because tradition is an easier pack to carry than regret. He says aloud, "Let the weather be sensible," and laughs at himself because weather never is. Then he rides on and discovers, delightfully, that for one day it chooses to listen. Under the city, in a chamber where air gives advice by how reluctantly it moves, counterminers hold their breath to feel the earth's language. One taps a pick into a seam and feels a whisper answer from somewhere no map has yet earned. He mouths a number, and the man beside him nods. They will meet those other picks soon. They do not rehearse bravery, they inventory options. The lamp needs trimming, the brace needs another wedge, the rope should be moved, the knife should be where a blind hand expects it. After that, history takes its share and they take theirs, which is mostly silence. In a tent with a history of damp, a general looks at a map that has grown tired of being persuasive and asks a question he rarely asks. What if we do less? No one laughs. They have learned that sometimes restraint wins faster. They move a pin an inch. What follows looks like luck to people who weren't in the tent. It looks like arithmetic to the men who were. The shopkeeper closes early because the light has a colour that suggests rain will change its mind twice in an hour. He puts away the stones he keeps for weighing herbs and considers, briefly, throwing the old coin into the river. Then he doesn't. He will keep it as a reminder that the past is better as metal than as story. He makes tea that tastes faintly of mint and something else, safety maybe, and drinks it on the step where a cat decides his lap is furniture. He obliges. The cat purrs like a small well-made engine. A woman who has studied palaces until their floor plans visit her in dreams writes a line that gently contradicts her favourite professor. The labyrinth is only cruel if you hurry. She will teach students to walk slowly and keep one hand on the wall, to be bored on purpose until the building starts telling the sort of truth that doesn't flatter. Some will roll their eyes and race ahead. Some will stop and listen and come back changed in ways that refuse to notarize themselves. Learning at its best is invisible renovation. At last, the night arrives that pretends to be emptier than it is. Keys settle. Pigeons adjust their opinions about ledgers. A child falls asleep mid-sentence and wakes later to finish it, because not even dreams interrupt her sense of grammar. The fan hums gently in your room. The thread is warm where your fingers held it. If you tug, more scenes will come. The next siege that resembles an older argument, the next letter that moves a map, the next anonymous artisan whose square edges keep a world from wobbling. If you don't, the scenes will wait without sulking. That is their best quality. History, when told properly for sleep, is patient. It means to walk you to the door of a manageable morning and leave you there with a nod. So let the last images blur to the useful kind of indistinctness. A rope that does not snap, a wall that answers slowly, a palace that breathes, a queen who chooses a word like a key, a shopkeeper who prefers peaches to purses, a baker who solves courage with barley, a child who redraws chalk without complaint. Let them drift until they turn into the sound of your own breath counting out a truce with the dark. The thread will keep its shape beside you, simple as string, strong as promise, ready to lead you out or in, whichever you decide when morning opens its hand. Lift the thread again and it draws you toward a shore where siege becomes a water problem. A harbour city hunkers under blockading sails, its wharf quiet except for ropes twitching against bollards and the occasional gull surprised to find so little fish guts. Nets hang idle like tired arguments. In a loft above a chandlery, a chartmaker inks tiny arrows to show the prevailing winds and circles a lane. He has learned the blockader's neglect when the breeze shifts just so he doesn't captain a ship. He gives a fisherman a folded scrap and a prayer disguised as advice. Hug the shadow of the headland. Count to 50 after the light on the reef, then run. That night, 2 skiffs slide out with barrels disguised as ballast. Salt, vinegar, a coil of good rope, and slide back in with news worth more than cargo. The blockade yawns if you time your breath. Along the seawall, a cooper hammers hoops onto staves while telling anyone who'll listen that good barrels are the difference between famine and boredom. He's right. Brine keeps fish from lying, rain keeps men from lying to themselves about thirst, and staves that don't leak create a cushion of days thick enough to turn panic into patience. He tests every seam with a miserable little song that no one else knows. The tune changes when a stave is true. He calls that music. Up at a citadel shaped like a lesson in geometry, a signaller works shutters, mirrors, wags, whatever the weather allows, and invents a grammar of flashes that even a tired garrison can digest without confusion. He keeps it spare, numbers for places, colours for urgency, a single symbol for stop guessing and come see. Messages spend their lives being too clever by half. His are simple enough to survive rain. When fog closes the day like a door, he sets the apparatus down and teaches 2 boys to tie 3 knots that never embarrass a rope. If you can't send words, send readiness. In a quiet room where a parchment curls in damp, the scribe prepares a cipher not to hide treason, but to protect caution. He chooses a phrase from a psalm as the key because the quartermaster knows the tune. He teaches the messenger exactly one trick, how to turn a vowel into a step and a consonant into a finger count, so that, if taken, the man can forget without acting. Forgetting on purpose is a mercy seldom taught in schools and often needed at gates. Under the city, a tangle of drains and culverts grumbles at neglect. A mason with hands like river stones climbs down with a lantern and a stout stick. He scrapes roots from a throat of clay, knocks loose a clot of leaves, rebuilds a broken trap that used to keep rats out of kitchens. No one will applaud him. Fewer fevers will visit because he chose to get wet. Later, when someone writes that the city held, they will not mention his stick or the stink he wore home. History often forgets the nose's work. On a hill of hard grass, forage parties learn to move like thoughts you don't want noticed. A woman who once gathered herbs for calmer reasons tests a stem between teeth and decides the herd that grazed here yesterday had iron shoes and impatient riders. She points toward a fold in the land where weeds flatter tired horses. Her company drinks in shifts, not because of orders, but because she watches who shakes when they set their cups down. Calm can be distribution as much as it is character. In a workshop that smells of vinegar and ash, a saltpeter man tends his leaching tubs, muttering measurements as if they were recipes for bread. He knows that powders are only as faithful as their parts and that damp lies for a living. He dries his crystals with a patience that saves fingers later. Outside, a boy asks whether thunder has a smell. The man says yes and no. The powder does, the air does, fear does not, it only borrows other scents. The boy nods as if this were mathematics. Beside the north gate, a herald practices the exact pitch that carries without sounding like arrogance. He will read terms later. He will be jeered by one side and ignored by the other, and then, briefly, respected when everyone discovers that a clear voice keeps people from dying by accident. He oils his throat with honey and lemon, and copies the words 3 times because paper fails loudly and memory fails quietly. He prefers the kind of failure you can hear coming. On a street where shutters rattle when carts pass, a guild of weavers votes to send blankets to the wall without asking which banner claims the parapet this week. They've watched winter's bully heroes. Warm bodies argue better. They stitch initials into corners not to claim credit, but to track returns. Good blankets deserve to outlive slogans. A midwife arrives, scolds everyone for drafting too many men with coughs, and leaves with 2 wool squares because a newborn won't wait for peace to be tidy. The weavers nod. Work remains work. At a monastery that knows how to listen to distances, a bell ringer sets a pattern that signals not danger but steady hours. He learned during the last siege that panic loves silence almost as much as noise. He keeps the rhythm honest. People eat when they belong to a day, they forget when days belong to fear. When a traveller knocks, the guestmaster opens, feeds and asks for news after bread, not before. Hospitality is intelligence with manners. A moneyer in a cramped mint stares at ingots that are not what they should be. Someone has mixed too much base into the silver upstream. He has 3 choices: strike coins that lie, refuse and starve, or fix what he can by skimming one wrong with another until the weight tells truth if the shine does not. He chooses the third, marks the edge with a tiny star to warn the honest, and sleeps badly anyway. In the market next week, a woman will test a coin with her teeth and decide to trust that star. That is how economies limp through sieges, with agreements between strangers who prefer fairness to cleverness. Out in a field gone to thistles, 2 spies meet without admitting they are spies. One sells onions, the other buys. Between price and change, facts pass without growing adjectives. The captain with the scar on his hand is gone. The cannon moved closer, but not by much. They're saving their better powder. Rain in the passes, snow beyond. Each returns to a different town and says nothing poetic to anyone. Their onions make dinner better. Their news makes maps better. Enough dinners and maps, and you call it survival. In a long room baked warm by loaves, a baker teaches an apprentice how to hear, when a crust is done without looking, a dry whisper when tapped, a shy sigh when the oven door opens. He tells the boy that bread is made of patience and yeast, in that order, and that a city that keeps its ovens lit keeps its courage tidy. The boy asks about sawdust. The baker frowns. We stretch with barley. We do not lie with wood. He wraps 2 extra heels for the infirmary, and labels them with a chalk mark that means this one is a kindness, not a habit. At a bastion with angles like advice, a woman sighting along a gun carriage adjusts a wedge no thicker than a thumbnail. The ball will land 2 houses closer to the battery for that thumb's pride. She takes no pleasure from the thought and plenty from the precision. When the shot thumps, she tastes iron in her mouth and spits behind her shoe so the taste stays outside. The crew says nothing. They swab, they load, they aim. Even terror loves a checklist. Night brings mist and the kind of quiet that fools the careless. A patrol on the wall stops talking and learns something worth keeping. How differently rain sounds on stone versus wood. Somewhere a ladder tests that difference. A jester who has outlived his jokes coughs mid-skit and points at the sound as if it were a punchline. Men laugh and lean to look. The ladder goes away. The jester bows and sits down hard, hands shaking, bells complaining. Comedy pays its rent. Far from bells and parapets, a teacher in a village that has seen 3 banners in 2 months explains to children why rivers curve. She draws in dust with a stick, sets leaves afloat in a puddle, and makes a point so gentle it sneaks past fear. The land answers to reasons older than armies. One child goes home and decides to plant beans on the side of the garden that keeps water longer. In 10 days his mother smiles for the first time in weeks and doesn't know she is smiling because of a lesson about meanders. Small causations are the kindly ones. Down in the drains again, the mason checks his trap and finds it working. He nods to himself and thinks of soup. At the harbour, the skiffs return with barrels, 1 less than promised, which is still a victory. The chartmaker adds a dot to his map and offers thanks to wind without pretending wind can hear. On the rampart, the signaller folds his flags and teaches 1 more knot. Below, the weavers lay blankets on a bench so the night watch can find them without waking anyone. The moneyer stamps another star. The baker taps 2 loaves that answer properly. The jester sleeps like a man who has earned nothing and kept much. In your room, the fan hums and the thread rests along your fingers as if it always knew the way back. The scenes have their edges sanded down by use. They stack neatly. You can keep going upriver to bridges that argue with floods, across steppe where supply is made of horse sense, into workshops where glass becomes lenses that let commanders see farther than fear, or you can set the coil beside the lamp and let it be a promise rather than a demand. Either way, the lesson keeps its simple shape. Craft beats panic, patience beats spectacle, and most victories arrive wearing the clothes of chores. So let the harbour darken without drama. Let the bell ring for hours that ask nothing grand. Let the cipher sleep inside a cuff and the barrels breathe quietly and the blankets earn their warmth. Let the city exhale into a night sturdy enough to hold it. Let the thread soften in your palm until it feels like habit. When morning comes, you will know where to pick it up, and the path, sensible, unhurried, strong, will lead you on. Raise the thread again, and it draws you over a river that has learned to argue with bridges. The current shoulders pass piles and chews at banks with a patience that outlasts generals. On one side, pontooniers unroll canvas, lash boats, lay planks, and turn water into road by discovering, rediscovering, and then checking again the wayload spreads through timbers. A man with rope-burned hands tests each knot by feel, not bravado. He prefers knots that confess their intentions early. Upstream, carpenters set crib work where the river behaves like a hinge. They fill it with stone that tells the water gently, go around. When the first cart crosses without complaint, that nobody cheers. They send the second cart, then the third. Reliability loves repetition more than applause. On the far bank, a veterinary kneels beside a mare whose patience has limits. He speaks to her as if she were a comrade. Soft words, steady hands, an apple tucked where surprise becomes agreement. He scrapes a hoof, oils a cracked frog, wraps a sore fetlock with linen that smells faintly of mint because the apothecary across the lane is generous with cuttings. Armies, he mutters, are the sum of sound feet and decent hay. He is right, and he is ignored until the day a column moves because animals can. In a low room shot through with furnace glow, a glassmaker turns breath into clarity. He gathers, rolls, turns and draws a thin disc that will later be ground into a lens. The The apprentice who watches asks whether seeing farther makes men wiser. The master says it depends which direction they look. On a distant wall, a commander will angle that lens toward a hill and learn to measure not courage but angles. Where a road bends behind trees, where a gun sits under a camouflage net, where a banner shows more cloth than conviction. The lens will be called ingenious. The patience that smoothed it will be called just a trade. An apothecary lays out jars in the order a day will need them. Vinegar, honey, spirits, ash, wool, willow bark, clean water. She has stitched soldiers and bakers, captains and thieves. She knows that cleanliness is slower than heroism and more effective. A boy with a split knuckle arrives. She cleans, wraps and tells him to keep it dry. He doesn't. He returns sheepish, she wraps again, and tells him a story about a man who lost a finger to impatience, which is a way of remembering anatomy without pictures. He keeps it dry. Under a white flag that lifts and drops like a tired breath, enemies meet between lines to trade prisoners and promises. The herald with the clean voice reads terms so that even grief understands. A carpenter from one side lends a saw to a carpenter from the other, because boards do not care about uniforms. Both men cut planks to carry bodies back with decency. Someone offers a flask, someone else refuses with a nod that is not an insult. The sun crosses its own treaty with clouds. Later, men on both walls sleep a little easier for having seen that their monsters have hands like theirs. Snow arrives and turns the siege into a lesson about heat. Firewood becomes currency. Smoke gives away secrets. Breath shows on air like thoughts doing confessions. A quartermaster scratches coal and underlines it twice. The baker stretches flour with barley and pride. The stew pot makes democracy in bowls. Sentries trade mittens the way monks trade books. Carefully, gratefully. Frost cracks a poorly patched wall. A mason hears it before anyone sees it and shakes his head at the arrogance of lime laid too fast in autumn. He mutters a weather prayer a grandmother taught him. Slow to set, slow to break. In a rope walk longer than some streets, fibres twist into lines that will not fail. The rope maker paces backward with measured steps while the wheel spins opinion into certainty. He spits on his palm, rubs, tests, listens. The lay sings when it is true. He sends coils to the siege park, to ships, to wells. He keeps one back for the bell founder up the hill, because the bell that marks hours and alarms should hang from rope, made by a man who sleeps well. The bell founder, meanwhile, pours bronze into a mould that smells of earth and beeswax. The alloy is a treaty between copper and tin. An extra whisper of each changes the voice. When the bell cools and speaks, it says, "Time," in a tone that makes farmers look up and soldiers count breaths. Time, too, is logistics. At a monastery where winter owns the stones and spring rents them, a water clock trickles through a narrow throat. The novice assigned to keep it honest moves pebbles at measured intervals and learns how attention becomes a civic duty. He will grow to be the kind of man who notices leaks before they become opinions. Outside, a sundial shrugs off clouds. A watchmaker in town files teeth on a gear until the tick refuses to argue. A chain of beacons crouches on hills like patient cats. A watchman with toque reddening his eyes opens shutters and plays an old melody of light. 1 flare for muster, 2 for river trouble, 3 for riders, a steady burn for hold. At night, oil argues with wind. He shields with his body because messages deserve chaperones. Down in a valley, a pigeon loft fusses. Birds peck, coo, circle. Children feed them grain with solemn concentration. When messages ride birds, they ride children's kindness too. Behind a door that now answers in a friendly latch, the man who used to live by the blade sits with a ledger he pretends is complicated and a cup he washes before it needs washing. A customer brings news by accident. Her cousin's cousin is in a city that just surrendered, and the terms were fair because the man who read them had a voice like reason. The shopkeeper smiles without meaning to. He sharpens a kitchen knife, not a story, and hears himself tell the boy who watches, "The point isn't the point, it's the edge." The boy nods with the gravity's childhood gives to phrases that sound like secrets. On the sea, shipwrights chalk lines that curve like conviction. Keels drink tar, ribs bend over fire, planks take caulking that saves lives without ceremony. A foreman taps a seam, it answers with a note he trusts. Engines of wood and wind leave harbour at dusk because risk is quieter then. Nets go out, nets come in. A single barrel of vinegar eludes a blockade. No one sings, singing wastes breath, breath is savings. In a school where maps hang with edges browned by thumb and time, a teacher sets a mariner's astrolabe on a table and shows how the sky is a clock if you don't hurry it. A child sights along its edge and discovers that measurement feels like permission. She will grow into someone who plans a bridge with angles that laugh at floods. Her grandmother will say she was always good at string. The truth will be that she was good at patience. On a ridge where star-fought angles make geometry feel like a friend, a gun captain glares at recoil like a personal insult until he learns its rhythm. He places the trail spade just so, chocks the wheel with a wedge that was a spoon in its previous life, and keeps powder dry because dry is the difference between history and rumour. The magazine crew counts with dirty fingers and clean habits. One foolish spark kills faster than an enemy shot. They practice silence with the door open and noise with the door shut, which is what good training sounds like. An accident happens anyway. A lamp tips, a spark jumps, a man's sleeve learns a lesson. The crew stamps, smothers, breathes, checks, inventories, apologises to the part of the world that could have ended, then goes back to carefulness with a humility that will keep many mornings possible. A sergeant writes the event in a small book no one else reads and underlines a word twice, almost. Almost is sometimes the best author of improvement. Below, in a street that pretends to be a market when shells fall short, women trade thread and news. A midwife instructs a terrified father how to boil water without wasting fuel. A sweep teaches a mason the trick of smoke that returns because his drafts love to sulk. When a burst cracks a crock, a potter hands over a new one with "pay when you can" scratched into the base. Trust keeps economies from freezing. At the dusk, a flag of parley is raised again. Not for bodies this time, but for terms. The herald's voice carries. The enemy commander answers with a soldier's curt courtesy. No one expects nobility, everyone expects clarity. They get it, and with clarity comes the strange fatigue that follows restraint. Before dawn, the gates will open, the keys will clink, the first carts will groan through, and a bell somewhere will choose a tone that sounds like survival rather than victory. Beyond all of it, a ridge of olive trees leans into wind that remembers older wars and fewer names. A shepherd counts by stones and by sheep, and decides, for reasons and none, to sleep on the upwind side tonight. He hums to the dog hums back in its way. Stars ask nothing, answer nothing, and glow with the same indifference that made sailors wise and lovers foolish. If you need comfort, take this. Indifference is also stability. Back at the ruins that taught stories to turn, a conservator peels gauze from a fresco and discovers a small, bright curl of blue no one had catalogued. She laughs under her breath. The best audience for joy is always yourself, and notes the pigment with a care that feels like prayer and is. A guide will point to that blue tomorrow, and a stranger will feel inexplicably better, the way colour can sometimes do what speeches can't. A child will ask if the dolphins ever get tired of swimming. The guide will say no, because any place that remembers how to move without leaving is a good lesson for a mind that races. The monk who tends the water clock changes pebbles with fingers that are becoming deft. He writes a line in a private notebook. Time is a patient river. My job is to keep it from sulking. He closes the book quickly, embarrassed by his own poetry, then opens it again and adds, also, mend robe. Important things make room for small things. That is how they stay important. The shopkeeper washes his single cup a second time and tells himself enough. He sets the old coin on the table and stares until it becomes only coin. Then he fetches the box where he keeps truly useful things: needles, thread, string, 2 spare buttons, a splinter of whetstone, a pea-sized lump of wax, a stub of pencil, and a scrap of paper with a list of 3 names he intends to forget. He burns the scrap over the stove and opens the window so the smoke can leave without touching anything. Forgetting done right is housekeeping. A baker at last racks loaves that sound done when tapped. He sets aside the almost burnt for men who say they like it that way and smiles because preferences are a form of dignity. He cuts 2 heels, the good part, for the guard who listened last week when a jester pointed, and for the woman who taught a boy not to spill. He puts the pieces in a bag and marks it with the chalk sign for kindness. Chalk is the currency of small benevolences. On the wall, a child draws hopscotch again, larger this time, as if ambition were a grid you teach the street. Boots will erase it by noon. She knows this and adds a second grid around the corner. She is inventing redundancy without knowing the word. Her mother watches from his window and hums, thread in her teeth, needle bright in her hand. The seam she makes will disappear into usefulness, which is all she asks of her work. You can keep following the thread, over ice roads where sledges turn winter into advantage, across steppes where supply chains speak horse into workshops where lenses become telescopes and commanders learn how far is farther than they thought. Or you can set it down beside the lamp and let your hands be empty for a breath. The fan hums, the room has the kindness of ordinary air. The lesson stays put. Bridges are arguments settled by craft. Walls are made of hands. Engines are checklists that learned humility. Letters are maps adjusting by inches. Palaces are questions with roofs. Queens choose words like keys, and the lives that held everything together still prefer to be called chores. Let evening close the ledger and tie the knots. Let the rope keep its lay. Let the bell speak hours instead of alarms. Let the barrels breathe and the drains remember their purpose. Let the beacon watch. The pigeons preen. The weavers fold blankets with corners square. Let the shopkeeper finish his tea and the baker dust his hands. Let the child hop, miss, laugh, and hop again. Lay the thread where you can find it in the morning. It will not tangle itself. It has learned your ways. When you pick it up again, it will lead you forward the same sensible distance as before, just far enough to see clearly, never so far you can't find your way back. Pick up the thread and it carries you into thaw, when winter's grip relaxes and the world becomes a ledger of mud. Roads lose their edges, wagons discover new talents for sinking, walls sweat where frost was yesterday. An engineer walks the parapet, tapping mortar with a wooden mallet and listening for lies. Soft spots answer with a thud. He chalks them with a mark that means fix before rain remembers how to argue. Down in the yard, a team lays fascines, bundles of brush that turn bog into path. They aren't glamorous, they work. In a small room near the infirmary, a woman lays out remedies like sentences she knows by heart. Garlic for appetite, willow for ache, vinegar for cleaning, boiled linen for honesty. She trains 3 teenagers to wash hands as if the washing were a spell that protects more than skin. They complain until the habit grips them. Later, when fever tests the city, the complaint will look like gratitude in disguise. Prevention is the quiet sibling of victory. At the Rivergate, boatmen learn spring's new moods. The current, fat with melt, tries to steal oars. Men answer with shorter strokes, lower voices, better timing. A boy with a pole vaults into shallow water to catch a drifting barrel before it kisses rocks. He grins at praise and then, instructed by a glare, grins smaller. Pride that learns proportion is a citizen's education. Over the plain, a travelling troupe sets up a makeshift stage on planks borrowed from patients. They juggle, sing, pretend to turn straw into gold, and in the middle of a comic bit, the jester pauses, looks up at the wall and delivers a line that is not a joke. You have held. There's a ripple. Laughter kinks, loosens, becomes something else. Morale is an organ. Sometimes it needs a chord instead of a speech. The troupe is paid in bread and blankets with initials stitched into corners. They bow to the initials. Under earth, the miners hit water in a seam they did not expect. Panic scratches at the back of the throat. The boss orders hush, then siphons not only liquid but dread, showing how a narrow trench, a pipe and a bucket can convince a flood to choose a kinder route. The crew learns a new respect. Ground has weather beneath weather. Above them, the engineer adds a note to his book. Water underlies rumour. If you listen before you dig, both tell the truth sooner. On the far side of the lines, a delegation arrives under a flag that remembers fewer insults than the men it shelters. They are merchants who have decided that profit is a version of peace worth negotiating. They argue exchange rates like theologians, then produce a crate of glass that makes distant things close. A gun captain looks through a lens and sees his own wall with a clarity that feels like embarrassment. Gaps he thought invisible, routines he thought random. He thanks the merchants in the brisk way men use when acknowledging instruction. The merchants depart with sacks lighter than when they came, and eyes heavier. Trade is a fragile armistice that moves on wheels. In the shop where knives are now for kitchens, a gardener's order arrives. Hoe, trowel, twine, seed in paper packets stamped with numbers instead of poems. The shopkeeper sells a spool of string and adds, in the old habit of small gifts that keep the street quiet, a stash of bean supports made of willow. He says they root if you're careless. The gardener says that would be a blessing, not a fault. They smile at the same idea from opposite ends. Later, a green row will stand where nothing stood, and a child will learn the first lesson of siege recovery. Food grows slower than fear, but wins if you start. In a lecture hall that used to be a granary, an old officer explains to a room of young heads why bastions prefer triangles, why ditches slope, why parapets love elbows and angles more than romance. He draws with charcoal on plaster and calls math by its given names. A student raises a hand and asks whether the rules change when the powder is stronger. The officer nods. Principles have longer lives than tools, he says. but tools write the gossip. The class laughs and writes both lines down, uncertain which they'll need first. At Knossos, spring light slants into stairwells like a habit the building taught the sun. A conservator discovers a faint thumbprint in plaster hardened 3 millennia ago. It's not a king's, it's a worker's, a small mistake or a small signature. She photographs it, notes it, and smiles because this is how people enter history without horns, laurels, or swords, by pressing too hard for a heartbeat and leaving proof that hands were there. A child on the tour hears thumbprint and immediately sets their own thumb against the air, resisting the urge to touch. Learning is often the creation of an almost. Olympias lingers in the world by the work of scribes and the stubbornness of stories. In a theatre where school children perform a play about her that is more rumour than text, a girl with hair full of pins speaks a line that makes a teacher blink. Mercy is power that dares to appear. The teacher does not recall writing it. Perhaps no one did. The auditorium claps the same way a campfire accepts new wood. Myths stay not because they are accurate, but because they carry sentences we cannot stop needing. Rain returns and turns drill into mud ballet. The captain with mismatched thread in his strap adjusts schedules so men rest in cycles that obey the sky. He writes again to the quartermaster, water, salt, oil, sleep, and adds boots. The quartermaster replies with 2 words, almost enough. The words are more reassuring than a sermon because they sound like ledger truth. In the bakery, a batch of loaves bursts just right, domes glossy, sides singing when tapped. The baker holds one to his ear like a seashell, satisfaction measured in tone. He sends the first 5 to the gate where the night watch kept their eyes honest. He writes the chalk mark for kindness, and beside it, a small star to mean return the basket this time. A day of accident arrives on schedule. A sling tears as the trebuchet's arm rises. Fibres sigh apart and a stone tumbles early, bouncing in the field like a bad idea. No one is hurt. The foreman lifts the wrecked sling and says nothing dramatic. The ropemaker swears quietly at his own pride and promises a better splice by evening. Failure, given dignity, becomes instruction. Men stop glancing at the sky for punishment and begin looking at their hands for the next correct thing. The patrol on the wall learns a new tune. Frogs in the ditch announce evening like a rural choir. One soldier starts counting croaks between flashes of fireflies and discovers, to his delight, that the numbers settle into a rhythm that matches the steps of a good march. He hums it, others take it up. They don't know they are catching their own coherence. They call it the frog song. It carries them through a watch without gossip or yawns. When a ladder bumps the wall after midnight, the frog song snaps into silence and the men become very precise. The moneyer with the star on his coins is visited by a city official who wants shine to equal weight again. He explains the ore, the furnace, the scale, the trick. She listens with a frown that is respect, not disapproval, and together they invent a mark that says, honest in a difficult time. It isn't Latin. It's a notch only a thumb can read. Market women learn the notch in 3 days. Economies are contracts between hands more than between laws. A truce day passes into a rain day, and then an odd day when nothing large happens and everything small matters. The bell decides on the hour instead of the alarm. The beacon drinks its oil, then rests under a hood. Children chase each other around stacked fastens and are scolded gently, because play and preparation need the same space and someone must choreograph the dance. The apothecary sits with a mother whose baby refuses sleep and invents a lullaby, made of old stories smoothed into nonsense. The mother cries a little. The baby does not sleep. The apothecary rocks both. The assassin who became a merchant of carefulness plants beans in the evening, and a row of marigolds to persuade certain insects to take their appetites elsewhere. He waters as if patience were a liquid. A stray dog investigates and is persuaded by tone to investigate the other side of the yard. He pockets the old coin, then takes it out again, then sets it on the windowsill where sunrise can fade it into simple metal. He goes inside and without meaning to sleeps a night without waking. In the morning he cannot remember whether he woke because he did not. He makes tea and decides to be the kind of man who lends ladders. News slips through in packets too small to tax. A distant bridge held, a nearer mill turned its wheel again. A cousin wrote from a town that has fewer banners and more bread. The signaller adds 2 new codes. One for all clear that means only for today. One for small joy that means bread, blankets, baby, beans. His boys learn them faster than grief changes subject. They practice with flags until technique looks like grace. From the hill, the sequence flashes. Small joy, small joy, small joy. Men smile on purpose. The spring festival arrives limping and decides to dance anyway. Stalls appear in the square with onions, thread, songs and mended pots whose scars are painted gold because someone heard once of a place that honours brokenness that learned to be strong. A fiddler tunes. A drummer finds the heart of the crowd and taps it gentle. A singer chooses a key that lets tired voices join. The captain, the quartermaster, the rope maker, the weaver, the baker, the apothecary, the engineer, the miner, the herald, the teacher, the jester with bells he rarely uses now, the gardener with marigolds on his hands. They stand near one another without ceremony and become a city by proximity. Even at Knossos, someone hangs a ribbon where a breeze can argue with it. And a dolphin on plaster seems to move a little. A guide tells the group, "Walk slowly. The labyrinth is friendly if you are." And no one rolls their eyes. They try it, and some look surprised to discover that friendliness is a navigational tool. A child whispers to a wall, "Stay," and the wall, being stone, does not answer, and being history, unquestionably does. Night slides over. Beacons blink like disciplined stars. The bell takes the hour and makes it sound survivable. A letter arrives in a cuff and pours 2 patient sentences into a commander who needed exactly 2. A rope that almost failed does not. A bridge that almost washed away holds. The frog song resumes where it left off. A child redraws hopscotch, then adds a second grid for tomorrow. The shopkeeper closes his door and leaves the latch with the soft confidence of a hinge that trusts its screws. The thread lies on your table like a habit that knows its job, to lead you forward only as far as you need to go to sleep, then to wait without complaint for morning. Lift the thread and it pulls you into heat, the kind that makes iron too honest and tempers men down to their essentials. Streets shimmer, wells lower their voices, mortar sets faster than prudence. The quartermaster rewrites his list to match the season. Water, shade, salt, sleep. He underlines shade because it requires planning as much as carpentry. In the yard, boys lash awnings between posts and walls, learning that comfort can be engineered and that canvas, well placed, is policy. In the orchards beyond the bastion, women spread cloth beneath trees and bring fruit down with sticks that know how to be gentle. Apricots give up first, figs second, pears bide their time the way good advice does. The girl runs baskets to the gate, and the sentry pays with a coin marked by the moneyer's thumb notch. She tests it, tucks it, and teaches her little brother the trick. Economies pass in lessons quicker than in laws. A mason climbs a scaffold to brush lime wash across a face the war left tired. He moves slow because heat goes to the head and scaffolds prefer modesty. Below, an apprentice mixes lime and sand and sings very badly. The song is a measure. 3 verses to slake, 2 to add, 1 to rest. The rhythm keeps rashness from the bucket. On the 3rd day, the wall goes pale as a breath taken after fear. The captain walks by and mistakes the feeling for pride. The mason accepts the mistake. On the river, millers coax wheels that sulked all spring. They clear jams, oil bearings, and let the current do the arithmetic of hunger into flour. A boy dips his hand in the outflow and grins at cold. He will remember that sensation long after dates and names slip. Memory keeps what it can carry. Under a tent with a clerk for shade, a census returns from rumour to count. The steward asks names, trades, ages, children, and how many mouths in a house borrow bread from someone else's shelf. People answer too quickly or too slow. Both are jokes the ledger knows how to forgive. At the end of the alley, a widow writes her name with care you could use to set a bone. She adds weaver and 3, then crosses out 3 and writes 2. The clerk does not ask. He makes a mark in the margin that means check for blankets in winter. Good government is a series of penciled intentions. Beyond the walls, the engineers visit the old siege park to retire what once frightened. A trebuchet's frame becomes a barn's rib. Its axle becomes a bridge stringer. Its sling, cut into lengths, becomes bucket handles and harness mends. The rope maker, grinning, calls it reincarnation for honest hemp. A boy visiting with his father asks if any of the wood will miss throwing stones. The foreman says wood only misses being badly used. The boy nods like someone who has watched adults grow up backward. In the infirmary, the apothecary swaps winter jars for summer ones. Mint and vinegar for faintness. Rosewater for tempers. Chamomile for heads that carry too many orders. A soldier comes in with heat rash where armour insists on touch. She powders him with something older than all his slogans, mutters air, and sends him to stand under a lintel where the passage makes wind. Relief takes the shape of architecture as often as it takes the shape of mercy. At mid-morning, the herald who once read terms practices a different craft: charters. The weavers want a guild seal that says their blankets will be weighed by hands and not by reputations. The smiths want a clause about apprentices sleeping near forges only if someone listens for bad dreams. The bakers, with their unbeautiful pragmatism, want a standard loaf that won't be cheated by new measures. The herald writes, reads, rewrites. The city will keep for a generation what the ink keeps today. By afternoon, the school takes its desks outside under plane trees. A teacher draws triangles in dust and shows how shadows tell time if you give them a stick and respect. A girl asks whether time treats everyone the same. The teacher pauses, then moves the stick 2 hand widths and says, "It depends where you stand." The class groans at the kind of answer that is both true and impolite. The girl smiles because the world just admitted its bias out loud. News rolls in from roads that have remembered their job. A bridge held through freshet. A market reopened under a roof that used to be a banner. A cousin returned with a wife who speaks 2 languages and makes soup that persuades arguments to steal up early. The signaller adds 1 more code to his flags, a steady sweep for homecomings, plural. He drills the boys until the sweep looks like ease. From the hill, the city watches good news travel at the speed of attention. At Knossos, Summerlight pulls colour out of walls as if it were a crop. Conservator runs her palm above a fresco without touching, feeling the cool geometry of air that hasn't moved much in 30 centuries. She leads a group gently along and lets a silence sit in the throne room. A child whispers, "Is this where the Minotaur sat?" The guide shakes her head. This is where decision sat. The answer is safer than accurate and exactly as useful. In a courtyard far from Crete, neighbours haul a cracked fountain bowl off its pedestal and argue cheerfully about how many men it will take to set the new one. The shopkeeper, who used to be a knife, brings rope and wedges and refuses to be in charge. He lets the loudest man be loud and the steadiest man be central. When the bowl settles, the water remembers how to sound like noon. The children cheer and then immediately drop apricots into the basin. The mothers scold and then laugh and then let the fruit bob because abundance should show itself. Twilight finds the archive. 2 clerks in cool rooms sort papers that the siege scattered and the heat has curled. They tie packets with twine and write the kind of titles that make later lives possible. Wells, repairs, streets shade, bread waits, widows winter. One slips a small drawing between statutes, a hopscotch grid and 2 sets of initials. He isn't sentimental, he's accurate. Streets work because play insists. The jester, less bells now, more timing, stands up at a courtyard festival and tells a story about a queen who scared men by choosing verbs carefully. He doesn't say her name, but everyone knows. He ends with a bow toward nothing in particular and the line, "Mercy that arrives late is still mercy if it stays." The baker claps hardest. A few soldiers stare at their shoes in the agreeable discomfort of changed minds. Night hardens the heat into stored advice. The bell chooses a tone that doesn't wake babies. The beacon watches hills that don't intend trouble and would appreciate being left off the list. The frogs at the ditch continue a math no one tests them on. The ropemaker checks a splice even though it will not be asked to prove itself. The moneyer sleeps because there are days when coins don't need him to be awake. In the small garden, beans climb the willow supports that turned blessing from mistake. Marigolds burn along the row like lamps that prefer dirt to oil. The shopkeeper sets the old coin in a bowl by the door, with 3 others, someone left in payment for a sharpening he refused to charge for. He resolves to take all 4 to the temple ledger that writes "Bread for those who forgot how" with the same care it writes royal names. Forgetting, when shared properly, becomes community. Dawn brings work shaped like happiness. A small kiln is mended and fired. Its first cups ring like bright ideas. A road crew lays cobbles and teaches a new man that a long street is just a collection of short decisions remembered. A midwife sits with a woman not yet ready and talks about water and soups and patience and jokes about kings. The woman laughs in the gap pain permits and finds air. The quartermaster, bored in the best way, scratches a different list. Surplus, 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 salt, oil, cloth, calm. Harvest starts. Men with scythes and women with rakes learn the old choreography again. A boy loses himself in the swish and fall, and hums the frog song without noticing. A cartwheel pops a pin and a stranger reaches in with a spare. The kind of kindness people who no longer fear scarcity allow themselves to carry. The cart rolls, the field nods, the sky looks like a reasonable god. A travelling judge arrives in a hat that declares procedure. He hears thefts, insults, debts, and the single case that matters, a man accused of clipping coin edges to shave weight. The moneyer testifies with the sleepy ferocity of someone who made a notch to save strangers. The judge orders restitution, not fingers, and adds public apology in a voice that makes no one feel entertained. Justice, like lime, sets best when damp with reason. By evening, heat relents. Carpentry finds its second wind. A carpenter planes a beam until the shavings curl like handwriting. He pockets a few curls because his daughter likes to make doll's nests out of them. The beam goes up level. Someone with a pitch pipe says the room hums in D. Someone else hears C. Either way, the room now has a note. Houses tuned on purpose keep arguments from echoing. If you want a small marvel before sleep, step to the edge of the water and listen to the bridge say yes to feet. Birds fold themselves into the understructure. A fisherman ties a knot that will not slip and thanks a man he has never met for inventing it. On the hill, the signaller practices the sweep for homecomings, because you can never practice that too much. In the square, the weaver's seal dries, the smith's clause is posted, the baker's standard loaf sits beside the example weight, and the guild scribe has ink on his wrist where it will stain until harvest ends. Back in the ruins, a gust runs a hand over plaster dolphins and leaves nothing but a feeling. A conservator locks the door like someone tucking in a relative. She whispers, "Stay," because a child taught her that word fits here. In your room, the fan hums and the thread rests across your palm with summer's easy confidence. You can pull it farther, to canals that turn downstream into storage, to granaries that count shadows as carefully as grain, to streets that learn to forgive noon, or you can let it lie. The path will wait, the night will loosen, the old engines will stay retired unless needed. The wall will keep its new colour, the bean vines will climb while you sleep. In the morning you'll find the thread where you left it, warm from the first light, ready to lead you just far enough into the day to find work shaped like hope. Pick up the thread and it carries you into the first crisp evenings, when heat loosens its stubborn hold and the air begins to smell like grain kept honest. Fields lean golden, wagons creak like old jokes, granaries open their mouths to receive a year's proof that patience can be measured. At the scales a steward sets out standards, weights rubbed bright, beans for calibration, a slate for numbers, and a child is appointed to say enough when the basket balances. The adults laugh and then obey, because fairness taught by a small voice is hard to argue with. Under a roof that used to shelter engines, carpenters and masons build a ventilated store for the harvest. Slatted walls court wind, floors sit high on stone piers to discourage rats and floods equally. The quartermaster writes a new list that is almost cheerful. Sacks, brooms, lime, lamp oil, rat dogs, ledgers, locks. He adds chalk twice. A clerk labels bays not with numbers but with names. A tired mind can keep. Northfield, Ben Meadow, River Strip. Because memory trusts places before it trusts math. The moneyer brings the notch-marked coins to pay gleaners and insists on hot soup at noon. Economies that eat together tolerate fewer lies. By the river, men test a set of new gates that are more than doors. They are promises to water. The lockkeeper, who speaks river the way a baker speaks dough, shows how to coax a barge up a difference in altitude without bruising either boat or pride. We don't fight the fall, he says. We borrow it. Boards fit into grooves, paddles lift, pressure equalises, the gate swings with the kind of dignity wood prefers. The first boat rises as if persuaded by an argument it respects. On the bank, children cheer as though gravity itself had agreed to be reasonable. On the road to market, a group of coopers roll barrels that clap softly on cobbles. Vinegar in some, oil in others, grain in many, one filled with clean water for the sake of the men who forget to think beyond thirst. A woman in a blue kerchief keeps count with her thumb, not her voice. At a crossroads, a travelling tinker trades a handful of copper rivets for a blanket with a weaver's initials stitched neat into the corner. He tucks the blanket around his tools and says, as if to the road, "Good work protects more than backs." The school moves indoors again. On the first damp morning, the teacher pins up a chart of winds and writes, "Prevailing is not the same as permanent." A boy snorts at the sentence until he tries to fly a paper kite in a courtyard swirl and watches it choose a new idea. Later, the class files to the river and looks through a lens, ground under summer's heat. They see upriver farther than their assumptions. The girl who liked triangles squints and murmurs about angles for a bridge that won't sulk in flood. She will draw it after supper, and her grandfather will say it looks like sense. In the infirmary, the apothecary moves fresh garlic into a jar of honey, and teaches 2 new helpers that Autumn asks for prevention that tastes like sweetness. She shows them how to scald rags and keep buckets ready. Smoke takes lungs as fast as fever, she says, and dispatches 1 helper to the watch captain with a suggestion. Night fire patrols paired with a cart already filled with water. The captain, who has learned to respect advice that arrives in practical nouns, nods and writes it down. Along the battlements, the engineer and the mason walk in companionable disagreement. The engineer taps with a mallet. The mason listens with fingers. They mark 2 hairline faults with chalk, choose lime over pride, and schedule repairs before rain makes opinions. Stone is patient, the mason says. So are leaks, the engineer replies. They grin. Argument is just craft with manners. Down in the yard, boys coil hoses beside the new cistern and practice passing buckets without looking. Their clumsy rhythm over an hour turns tidy. The signaller adds autumn codes, a square for harvest safe, a slow fan for granary full, a short long short for bridge sound. He drills his boys while leaves at last admit colour. When a caravan limps in from the hills with carts rim-deep in apples, pears and tired men, the hill flashes the slow fan and the city's shoulders drop as one. Small joy, small joy, small joy, flags say it, bells echo it. The frogs at the ditch simply keep counting. At Knossos, sea wind arrives, threaded with salt and rumour of storms. Conservators throw linen cloths over scaffolds and check the edges of cases with the brisk tenderness of nurses. A tourist asks whether the labyrinth was meant to trap or teach. The guide says, some rooms do both. Walk slowly. In a storeroom, a pottery shard with a thumbprint sits beside one with a palm smear. The 2 together look like a handshake across centuries. A child stops and whispers, stay again, and a docent smiles, having heard it all season like a benediction. In the square, guild representatives meet under a banner that says less than it means. Bakers bring their example loaf and weight. Weavers post their seal with a simple clause beneath. This warmth is reliable. Smiths pin up drawings that specify hammers for nails and hammers for people, and no one laughs. The herald reads the revised charter aloud in a voice that can be found from any corner. Clauses for apprentices who dream badly. Clauses for widows and winter. Clauses that weight honesty more than eloquence. The jester listens, says nothing, and then, when it is time, tells a story about a woman who wrote letters sharp enough to open futures. He ends without a flourish. The applause is a kind that mends. The shopkeeper who learned to lend ladders at last carries the old coin and its new companions to the temple ledger that writes bread for those who forgot how with a scribe's measured affection. He leaves the coins and takes a receipt that is only a nod and a line in a book he will never see. On the way back he stops at the fountain, watches a boy teach a younger cousin the knot for bucket ropes, and says nothing because the lesson is complete without witnesses. In the evening he oils a hinge, checks a latch, waters beans now taller than worry, and sits until the marigolds dim from lamp to ember. For the first time in years he cannot remember the weight of his own footfalls in a corridor. The memory has worn smooth like a stone a river decided to keep. Under the new awnings, a travelling printer shows the councillor press with teeth like patience. He sets type for a single page. Weights and measures, the baker's standard, the weaver's seal, the smith's clause, the night fire patrol, the beacon codes for small joys, and turns the handle until ink becomes law you can fold. Scribes keep memory. Presses keep gossip, the old officer mutters, and signs anyway. The first sheets dry on lines like laundry. Children volunteer to carry them door to door. Literacy arrives grinning. A judge returns to town and sits with merchants to settle arguments about river dues now that locks make boats behave. He rules that the first toll is for maintenance, the second for wages, the third for the lanterns that keep men from guessing at channels. The fourth? A merchant asks. There isn't a fourth, the judge says, and closes the book with a sound like restraint. Beyond the walls, stubble fields host geese that honk like bad trumpets. A field hand pauses, listens, and decides the frogs and geese together make a music more honest than parade bands. In the distance, scaffolds around a ruined tower turn into frames for a granary. The old siege park is nearly a farm. A boy who once ran messages for engineers now leads a mule that prefers apples to orders. He admires the mule's ethics and rearranges his pockets accordingly. A rain comes in steady, decent stripes. The streets receive it without sulking because drains were cleared when the days were long. In the drains, a mason's trap ticks and works. In the granary, a rat dog naps with nothing to do. On the wall, a patch dries into continuity so seamless the mason himself has to squint to find it. The bell chooses a note that admits weather and refuses alarm. The beacon stays hooded. The frogs give the evening back to insects who take it without gloating. Night draws in. The archive strings more titles. Locks, rules, fires, patrols, guilds, charters, coins, notch, children chalk. A clerk slips the hopscotch sketch into the folder again and is not scolded. The apothecary counts jars and, finding enough, sends her helpers home early, with a joke and a recipe for soup whose secret is barley and patience. The baker scratches the chalk mark for kindness on 2 bags, then adds a tiny star to one because a woman who returned a basket deserves to see herself remembered. The signaller rehearses the sweep for homecomings because the season grants such extravagance. In the ruins by the sea, the guide locks the last door and rests her forehead against cool stone. Stay, she says, because she likes rituals that don't demand proof. Somewhere inland, a queen's line in a school play becomes a proverb a generation carries in the pocket of their manners. Somewhere under a lintel, air moves because someone built the passage with kindness toward wind. Somewhere near a canal, a lock gate closes with the confidence of wood well set. And here, in the small room where the fan hums like a civil clock, the thread loosens across your palm. You can pull it farther, to tax carts with candled seals, to watchmakers who convince minutes not to quarrel, to autumn fairs where mathematics and mercy share a stall, or you can let it lie and let the night do what nights do best. Keep. Either way, the lesson remains intact and useful. Craft turns seasons into stability. Fairness likes to be written down. Water respects persuasion. Stone rewards attention. Myth borrow roofs from buildings that remember how to breathe. Mercy, even late, can still choose to stay. Set the thread by the lamp. In the morning you'll find it warm with ordinary light and ready to lead you exactly as far as the day requires. No farther, no less. Pick up the thread and it takes you into the first nights of frost, when breath becomes punctuation and roofs write their quiet sentences in white. Streets crackle under early carts, wells wear thin collars of ice that break politely at the bucket's insistence. The quartermaster returns to his old refrain, water, salt, oil, sleep, and adds wool to the top underlined twice. A weaver holds up a blanket with the guild seal stitched small and steady and says, warmth is a policy, and no one argues because the air has joined her side. On the river, fog moves like a slow thought. The lockkeeper works by sound, wood admitting water, iron agreeing to move, ropes discussing strain. He shows an apprentice the winter trick. Open the paddles as if you were apologising to the current, not correcting it. The barge rises with the kind of grace that comes from practice, not luck. Up on the towpath, a boy trots alongside with a lantern hooded against wind and learns that light's first job is to mind its own business. In the bell founder's yard, the mould for a small chapel bell is broken open like a careful egg. The bronze inside has kept its promise. The first tap answers in a note clean enough to rinse a day's noise from the mind. The rope maker arrives with a length meant for hands that pray, not panic. Same splice, he says, and the bell founder nods. Faith, clock, alarm. Rope prefers not to choose. The bakery smells of cinnamon because Harvest Festival refuses to be embarrassed by joy. The baker posts the printed sheet with weights and measures beside the example loaf and sets a basket under it with the chalk mark for kindness already drawn. He cuts heels for the night fire patrol, bread that travels well and forgives smoke, and adds a tiny star to the bag for the woman who returned the basket twice without being reminded. Reputation is a ledger that writes itself in small ink. At the edge of town, carpenters turn the last of the old siege beams into a covered market stall. The trestles remember tension and therefore stand as if they still expect to be useful. A travelling watchmaker hangs a sign shaped like an ear and tunes 3 battered clocks until their ticks stop quarrelling. He tells the girl who brings him tea, minutes can be persuaded, and she files it beside other useful facts, like which corner of the square loses sun first and where the best apples gossip in barrels. The Herald, now half clerk, half midwife to ordinances, reads a new page off the press. Night watch routes revised for early darkness. Chimney sweeps scheduled by the quarter. A reminder that the beacon's small joy signal is for bread, blankets, babies, beans, not fireworks. Paper makes order visible. The jester, listening, makes it habitable. He ends the reading with a story about a queen who learned to sharpen mercy until it cut cleaner than rage, and the applause arrives the way frost does. Quiet, everywhere at once. On the wall, the engineer and the mason trace thin white lines with chalk where mortar needs attention, before a hard freeze locks floors into next year. Stone keeps secrets badly, the engineer says. Good, the mason answers. So do men. They patch before weather can turn opinions into cracks. Below, boys practice passing leather buckets gloved in rags. A captain times them and does not shout because speed is shy around anger. In the infirmary, the apothecary steams the room with thyme and sage and teaches a new helper the winter hierarchy. Fire clean, water hot, air moving, hands honest. She sets out jars of goose grease and mustard for chests that forget how to breathe when wind scolds. A soldier arrives with a burn the size of a coin. She looks, hums, raps, and tells him to sleep on the side that refuses to be brave. He does, and wakes grateful for instructions that sounded like permission. Out by the marsh, the frogs have fallen suamut. The ditch outsources its rhythm to geese. The night watch learns a different counting. The faint hiss of frost settling on reeds, the brittle tick of ice forming in a bucket, the soft thump of a stray apple surrendering to gravity. A ladder tests the wall once and thinks better of it because the new hooks wear winter hats of grease and grit. The jester coughs in the dark, then laughs, and 5 heads turn the right way without being told. At Knossos, sea storms bruise the horizon purple. Conservators swaddle scaffolds. A gust licks the dolphins and leaves them where they have always swum. In a case near the throne, a thin coil of blue pigment peeks from under flaked plaster, a reminder that colour is a stubborn citizen. A child whispers stay as children have all season, and the guide, locking the last door, whispers it back to stone because rituals that don't demand belief deserve it most. On the canal, lanterns appear at intervals like punctuation teaching a paragraph to breathe. A judge rides the towpath with a clerk and checks that the 4th toll still doesn't exist. The clerk smiles at the joke he has heard enough to become fond of it. A ferryman dozes between bells and wakes in time to show a new hand the knot that water respects. This one promises to fail kindly, he says, and the boy ties, unties, ties again until his fingers can keep that promise in the rain. Markets contract into warmth. The weavers hang blankets along an alley that smells of wool and hot irons. The smiths sell hinges that swing with winter manners. The coopers drum lids and listen for boasts. A printer offers single sheets, guild marks, fire routes, beacon codes, a sketch of the new lock gates, a recipe's proportions that taste like neighbourliness, and refuses extra coin for any of them. Public paper, he says, as if naming a season. The shopkeeper who became a merchant of carefulness picks the last marigolds and hangs them upside down to dry. A row of small suns on a dim wall. He turns the old coin in his fingers and doesn't feel anything except metal. He drops it in the box where receipts and pebbles mark favours owed and favours forgiven, then closes the lid like a sentence finished without flourish. On his bench he sharpens a hook knife for a woman who mends nets, and shows her how to keep the edge without waking what edges used to mean. She leaves with the knife and a small paper packet labelled "String Spare," a gift he pretends not to notice giving. The signaller stains his fingers with lamp black and cold and drills the boys in the autumn codes until their arms remember what their minds forget under wind. They like the sweep for homecomings, plural, best, and practice it until the hills grin. From the ridge one evening, the pattern blooms without order, and then resolves. 3 farms sending the slow fan for granary full, a hamlet blinking harvest safe, and from the road, a steady sweep for cousins on carts. The city listens, and the bell chooses a tone that sounds like doors unlocking. In the archive, chords bind new bundles. Locks, winter, chimneys, soot, blankets, widows, weights, standard, coin, notch. Children, chalk, revised. The clerk slips the hopscotch sketch into the folder again and adds today's grid in the margin, because continuity deserves footnotes. A note arrives from the school. The girl with triangles has drawn a bridge that will not sulk in flood. It is pinned on a wall beside a sentence about prevailing not being permanent. The teacher writes underneath, "Good." At last a small fire happens and fails to become a large one. A spark in a chimney tries cleverness. The night patrol, bored into excellence, hears the wrong kind of crackle, wakes the right doors, passes buckets the practised way, and leaves only steam and a lesson. In the morning, the apothecary sends honey for throats. The printer prints the roots again. The sweeps bang brushes against their boots like drums, and the baker adds an extra heel to the patrol's bag with the chalk mark for kindness. A tiny star appears beside it, because memory likes symbols. A play is staged indoors where breath fogs lightly and laughter edits itself. The children say lines about a serpent queen, a storm-built palace, a city that learned to count its buckets, a jester who pointed at the sound that wasn't a joke, a bell that preferred hours to alarms, a rope that did not snap, a bridge that persuaded water to behave. When the girl playing the queen says, "Mercy is power that dares to appear," the parents look at each other with the pleasant shock of recognising a better version of what they meant to teach. Night puts its hand over the town and leaves room for lights. The beacon stays hooded. The bell breathes the hour. A lock gate sighs wood into water and clicks shut. A rat dog dreams of work it doesn't have. The frogs are quiet. The geese pass judgment. The wind writes notes on the shutters tuned in D or C, depending on who is listening. The marigolds dry into small suns. The bean vines crisp into ladders for frost. The old engines sleep in new shapes. The wall wears its patches as if they were decisions. And here, with the fan saying yes to the hour, the thread rests where your hand left it, uncomplicated as string, durable as habit. You can tug it further to winter markets where brass warms in pockets and stories buy bread, to river pilots who read ice like scripture, to watchmen who keep the air honest, or let it slacken, and trust that the path will stay memorised. The lesson hasn't changed and doesn't need to. Craft beats weather, fairness likes writing, water respects persuasion, stone answers attention, myths borrow roofs from buildings that breathe, mercy, on time or late, still chooses to stay. Set the thread by the lamp. Morning will find it warm again, ready to lead you just far enough into the day to reach work shaped like care. Lift the thread and it slips into deep winter, the kind that makes sound travel farther and schemes stay home. Snow softens streets into honest paths. Doors learn to close gently because wood prefers mercy in the cold. The quartermaster shortens his list to the essentials and tapes it to the wall where anyone can read it without asking. Wood, water, wool, watch. He underlines watch because winter's teeth are small and many. Chimney sparks, thin ice, lonely mines. On the river, the lockkeeper hangs a lantern where mist confuses distance. He teaches the apprentice the ice rule. Test at the bank with a pole, listen for the hollow note, believe it. A barge is left moored and boarded. Impatience waits on shore like a lesson that won't be learned today. Up on the towpath, hoof prints turn to iron flowers. The boy who carries the hooded light hums a steadying song that he learned from the bell. At the smithy, iron meets cold with a hiss that sounds like sense. The smith draws out hinges meant for doors that must not sulk in frost. An apprentice counts hammer blows under his breath to keep rhythm from being stolen by numb fingers. Between heats, the smith warms a hinge on his forearm and nods at the temperature of enough. Metal tells the truth, he says. Our job is to listen before we insist. The watchmaker sits close to a small stove and coaxes 3 clocks to agree. He files a tooth, adds a pin's weight of oil, wins. Minutes can be persuaded, he had said in autumn. In winter he proves the corollary, minutes sulk when cold. He wraps one case in wool like a child, smiles at the indignity of craft, and listens until the ticks stop quarrelling. Outside, the baker's second bell answers like a friend. The printer turns the press slowly, sheets steaming faintly in the air. Today's single pages are winter rules and neighbourly cheats. Sweep your flue before feast day. Loan a log, not a lecture. Check on people who do not knock. Keep stairwells salted. Remember the beacon codes. A small joy is still bread, blankets, babies' beans. Children carry their sheets door to door with the solemnity of postmen in training. Literacy arrives with mittened hands. Along the wall, the engineer taps the parapet where snow piles into flattering drifts. Under the white stone keeps its own opinions. He and the mason mark 2 seams for spring attention and 1 for today. They mix a hot lime putty that steams like soup and pack it where wind had tried charmer's tricks. Leaks are gossip, the engineer says. Stop them before they make friends. The mason laughs through his scarf. In the infirmary, the apothecary boils linens in a pot that inhales time and exhales permission. She shows the new helper the winter order again. Fire clean, water hot, air moving, hands honest. A grandmother comes in with a cough that insists on company. They send her home with a jar of mustard and a note for the night watch to check her door at moonrise. Some illnesses are cured with medicine, some with being expected. Markets fold inward and glow. The weaver's lane steams with wool and tea. A smith sells small braziers that save fingers and tempers. The coopers test lids by tapping, until the note rings like a line drawn true. The moneyer arrives with coins still wearing the thumb notch of honesty, and pays the chimney sweeps in advance because prevention has better exchange rates than regret. A rat dog unemployed by competence naps under the stall and dreams of undeserved heroics. At the canal, skaters test the first discipline of ice, fall where it's shallow and learn quickly. A ferryman shows a boy the winter knot that refuses to tighten when wet. It promises to fail kindly, he repeats, and the boy ties and unties until muscle learns the promise. The lock gate creaks as Wood complains in honest grammar. The lockkeeper pats the jam. Spring will forgive us both, he says. Knossos takes weather sideways. Rain arrives as theatre, then as hush. Conservators swaddle fragile edges and let the building breathe the way it taught them. A child, nose pink, asks if the dolphins mind storms. The guide says, they've had practice, and points at drains that still remember where to send water. In the case near the chair we refuse to call a throne, the curl of blue pigment stays obstinately itself. Colour doesn't negotiate with centuries, it simply continues. A winter court convenes in the Guildhall under beams repurposed from old engines. The herald reads 3 short ordinances, a firewatch schedule that rotates by streets, a wage for night bell ringers, a clause for apprentices whose bad dreams wake neighbours. The jester tells a brief story about a queen who wrote letters that kept men alive because they changed their minds by an inch. The applause is the soft kind that warms rooms. The shopkeeper who learned to lend ladders tips the last beans from their vines and coils the willow supports indoors. He hangs the dried marigolds along the rafters, a row of small suns against the dark. He sets a cup beside the stove, washes it before it needs washing, and folds the temple receipt into the ledger, where favours rest with pebbles. A woman brings a net to mend. He sharpens a hook knife and shows her a safer angle, a way to cut cord without inviting old instincts to wake. She nods, takes the blade, accepts a paper packet marked string spare, and leaves him with the sound of a latch behaving. Across the square a choir rehearses by breath clouds. They practice the note the bell has chosen for winter, less alarm, more hour, and learn to enter on the third swing as if joining a conversation already kind. A candle maker trims wicks into good manners, a mason sprinkles sand on icy flagstones without needing a decree, and thus a baker draws a chalk star on the bag for the night patrol, because gratitude likes shapes. A small emergency happens and ends correctly. A chimney roars, the neighbour with the bucket hears it first, the route the printer printed leads feet to the right door. The watch's boredom proves its worth, steam wins. In the morning the sweep bangs his brush against his boot like a drum and tells the child who watches that angles matter even to soot. The apothecary sends honey, the baker doubles the heels, the judge writes nothing because nothing more is needed than the story everyone already knows. School meets by daylight in the long room with windows that admit winter's honesty. The teacher sets a bowl of water on the sill and marks the hour its skin freezes. Precision is a blanket, she says, and the children laugh because blankets are better than metaphors. They take turns drawing frost patterns with breath and counting ticks between bell and echo. The girl who loves triangles sketches a truss for a footbridge that won't sulk under snow. The boy who loves knots ties one you can undo wearing mittens. Both are graded with the same word, good. On the ridge, the signaller drills the boys in slow flag so hands learn truth when lips can see less. They practice the sweep for homecomings, plural, always plural, and send it once for the joy of the shape. Down in the town, 3 doors open for cousins who arrive at dark with a cart, a fiddle and a recipe. The bell chooses the hour, the beacon stays hooded. Geese comment. The marigolds wait like memory. Evenings settle into a cadence that lets people breathe. The quartermaster's list shrinks again. Wood, water, wool, watch, windows. He adds windows because heat loves glass as much as stories do. The watchmaker checks the shutters that sing in D or C and nods at their tune. The ropemaker oils a splice that will not be tested if the city keeps its habits. The moneyer sleeps. The smith warms his hands over a hinge, pockets 2 curls of shavings for a child's doll nest, and locks his door with a hinge that answers yes. A play for winter tells familiar pieces. A serpent queen who chose verbs like keys, a palace that taught rooms to breathe, a city that learned to count buckets and knots, a jester who pointed at the sound that wasn't a joke, a bridge that persuaded water to behave, a rope that did not snap, a bell that preferred hours to alarms. When the child playing the queen says, "Mercy is power that dares to appear," someone in the 3rd row coughs and then stops, startled by the line's warmth and cold air. Night holds the town and leaves enough space for lamps to mean something. The bell breathes the hour. A lock gate sighs and settles. Frost writes on rails. The baker reads it with boots. The rat dog dreams again of employment and wakes to a scratch behind the ear. The frogs are silent. Geese patrol. The wind notes shutters with a critic's patience. The old engines sleep in their new shapes. The wall wears its winter repairs like decisions. Here, with the fan giving the room an honest hum, the thread rests where you set it, simple as string, steady as practiced, and tug it farther and you'll find ice roads turned into trade. Charcoal burners teaching heat to behave. glass ground thinner to read smaller letters, watchmen who count breaths on lonely streets, or let it slacken and trust the path to keep itself overnight. The lesson keeps its shape. Craft beats weather, fairness likes paper, water respects persuasion, stone answers attention, myths borrow roofs from buildings that breathe, and mercy, late or on time, still chooses to stay. Set the thread by the lamp. Morning will find it warm and ordinary, ready to lead you just far enough into the day to reach work shaped like care. Lift the thread and it finds the hour before dawn when winter thinks about letting go but hasn't told the roofs yet. Miho holds the river in careful handwriting. Carts whisper over it because men have agreed, for a few weeks only, that water may be used as road. The lockkeeper stands on the bank with a pole and a proverb: test where it lies, trust where it sings, and sends skaters ahead to listen. A barge sleeps under a quilt of straw, impatience shifts in its boards and then settles when the pole says no. A ferryman teaches a mittened boy the knot that still fails kindly. The boy ties, unties, and ties again until muscle keeps its promise even in numbness. In a woodlot beyond the last houses, charcoal burners tend their clamps like shepherds of slow fire. They stack, thatch, smear with clay, pierce with vents, and watch smoke talk in thin grammar. Too pale means sulk, too dark means greed, steady blue means yes. A girl brings bread and hears how heat must be taught patience before it can be trusted in a forge or a kitchen. She tucks that sentence where warming truths live and steals a splinter of charcoal for drawing maps on the frost. The smith opens his shop to a dawn that doesn't quite deserve it, and braises a hinge for a gate that must swing no matter the month. Between heats he rubs his hands over the small brazier a neighbour bought at market and admires honest design. A bowl, 3 legs, a draught that persuades rather than bullies, a handle that forgives. He pockets 2 curls of shaving for a child's doll nest and taps a pin into a latch that will answer yes in any weather. At the watchmaker's bench a lens grinds thinner than old habits, and the man who once said minutes can be persuaded now proves eyes can too. He fits the glass into wire and hands the spectacles to the printer, who laughs. Type that used to sulk at arm's length blossoms into sense at a handshake. The press breathes out a winter almanac no one asked for and everyone uses. Chimney days, market Saturdays, beacon codes for small joys, measures for bread, a sketch of the new lock, a reminder to knock on doors that haven't opened lately. The teacher invites the class to stand at windows and practice small accuracies. They draw a line where sun first touches the sill. They count ticks between bell and echo. They tap frost and write sin on their papers when it breaks politely. The girl with triangles sketches a truss that shrugs at snow. The boy with knots ties one you can undo with a sleeve. The teacher writes the same word under both. Good. She pins the bridge beside the sentence from autumn. Prevailing is not the same as permanent. And underlines nothing because the weather already has. The quartermaster takes a brave breath and writes a new heading. Candle days. Under it, wood, water, wool, watch, windows, wicks. He adds soup spare because hunger likes to arrive in the bodies of people who were fine yesterday. At noon he walks through the square and sees the list alive. Sweeps banging brushes like drums, a brazier doing decent work, a rope coil by a stair in case caution forgets itself, a basket with the chalk mark for kindness and a tiny star because the basket came back without being asked. Along the wall, the engineer and the mason tap the parapet and feel where cold has been sulking. They smear hot putty into a seam, pat it like bread dough, and write a small date in the corner so spring will know whom to thank. Leaks gossip, the engineer says. Stone listens, the mason answers. They smile. Argument done right is friendship. In the infirmary, the apothecary steeps time until the room remembers summer. She sends a boy to a grandmother's door with mustard and instructions. Sleep on the side that isn't brave. Open the shutter 2 fingers, drink water warm. She writes the night watch a note that says simply, look in. Some sicknesses need medicine. Some need a knock. At Knossos, weather comes sideways, then quiet. Conservators leave breathing room under wrappings. Drains receive rain as if they were paid to. A child with a pink nose asks whether dolphins mind storms. They've had their practice, the guide says, and points to a channel that still carries water away like a useful sentence. In the case near the chair we refuse to call a throne, the sliver of blue pigment refuses to negotiate with centuries. Colour persists without asking permission. The Guildhall gathers winter court beneath beams that once threw rocks and now shelter prudence. The herald reads 3 short lines off the press. Night routes rotated, wages for bell ringers, apprentices with bad dreams may sleep near sound. The jester stands only long enough to say a single thing about a queen who made room for mercy, even when it arrived late. The applause is the soft kind that warms a room. On the canal, lanterns mark grammar on black water. A judge rides the towpath with a clerk and checks that fourth toll still doesn't exist. The clerk grins. A skater falls in shallow water and rises sputtering to laughter that refuses cruelty. A ferryman shows him the promise knot again and says, "If you can tie it cold, you can tie it always." The boy ties, unties, ties. The shopkeeper who learned to lend ladders coils the last of the willow supports and hangs marigolds upside down like a row of small suns. He sharpens a hook knife for a net mender and shows her where not to put her thumb. She pays with coins that carry the money as notch and a quiet thanks. He tucks the thanks into the ledger, where pebbles mark favours owed and forgiven. He washes his cup before it asks and hears the hinge answer yes without flattery. A small fire happens and ends correctly. A neighbour hears the wrong crackle and kicks the right door. The printed route proves it wasn't just paper. The watch's practiced boredom pays. Steam wins. In the morning, the sweep bangs his brush like a drum and tells a child, angles matter even to soot. The apothecary sends honey. The baker doubles heels and adds the chalk star. The judge writes nothing because nothing more is needed than the story everyone already knows. Signals climb the ridge despite cold. The boys drill slow sweeps until hands remember what mouths forget. They flash homecomings, plural, always plural, because cousins arrive with a cart, a fiddle, a recipe. The bell answers with hour, not alarm. The beacon stays hooded. Geese speak their blunt opinions. The marigolds wait for spring like proof. When Thor arrives, it does so reluctantly and then all at once. Ice writes its last neat sentence and slides away. The lock groans, lifts, remembers. Bridges return to being bridges. The road apologises to wheels. Buckets become water again instead of glass. The quartermaster scratches out wool and writes shade, writes wicks and writes water twice, writes sleep because men forget. Under the heading Candle Days, he draws a line and writes simply spring. Fields unroll a green grammar. The gardener pushes bean seeds into last year's beds and laughs when willow stakes root where she was careless. She leaves them. A mistake that makes shade is a solution with self-esteem. Children chalk hopscotch wider than caution. Boots erase it by noon. They draw it again with redundancies learned over winter. The printer inks a single page that looks like a town thinking out loud. Weights, measures, small joys, fire routes, lock sketches, soup recipes, guild seals, and sends it door to door in mittened hands now bare. On market day, the watchmaker sets a small clock on a barrel and tunes it to the bell's new spring note. The baker brings an example loaf. The weavers hang blankets and thin cloth because weather is a sentence with clauses. The smith shows a hinge that has relearned to move like a courtesy. The coopers drum lids and listen for the clean vowel that means yes. The money-as notch moves through palms like a handshake. The judge declines to invent a fourth toll. The jester keeps his bells quiet and his timing sharp. A play returns with lighter coats. A serpent queen who chose verbs like keys. A palace that taught rooms to breathe. A city that learned to count buckets. A jester who pointed at a sound that wasn't a joke. A bridge that persuaded water to behave, a rope that did not snap, a bell that preferred hours to alarms. When the child playing the queen says, "Mercy is power that dares to appear," someone in the third row looks down at their hands and decides to write a letter that will move a map by an inch. Night lets spring in. The bell breathes the hour. The lock gate sighs with work. Frogs start again and men smile at the old song. Geese grow bored and go elsewhere. The marigolds lend their dried sons to seed packets. Beans climb because they don't know how not to. The old engines rest in new shapes. The wall wears its repairs as decisions. Here, with the fan saying yes to the hour, the thread lies where you left it, simple as string, stubborn as habit. Tug it and you'll find ice roads turn to trade. Charcoal teaching heat to behave. Lenses making print lean closer. Watchmen counting breaths for lonely doors. And then the endless ordinary. Lists that keep shrinking to the essentials and growing to include kindness. Or let it slacken and trust the path to keep itself until morning. The lesson hasn't changed and doesn't need to. Craft beats weather. Fairness likes paper. Water respects persuasion. Stone answers attention. Myth borrows roofs from buildings that breathe. And mercy, late or on time, still chooses to stay. Set the thread by the lamp. Morning will find it warm and useful, ready to lead you just far enough into the day to reach work shaped like care. Pick up the thread and it draws you into second spring, the brisk, busy weeks when ground gives back tools without complaint and plans that winter rehearsed finally clear their throats. Paths lift from mud to firmness. Carts find their old manners. Doors stay open long enough for houses to trade air. The quartermaster revises the margin of his list: wood, water, shade, salt, sleep, and adds spares, underlined once. Spare pins for cartwheels, spare wick for lanterns, spare patience for noise that comes with mending. Along the river, the lockkeeper teaches a new rhythm: raise slow, let water talk, lower clean. A barge glides up on a column of argument the paddles have persuaded into order. On the towpath, a lantern is no longer needed. Boys switch to fleckers and learn their colours as if learning a neighbour's names. The signaller adds a new code for the season, a crisp chevron that means bridge-proof tomorrow, and drills until arms remember it without thinking. Out at the bend where frost pulled stones loose, the bridge the girl drew lives in timber now. Carpenters tightened its trusses when the wood was cold, so summer's swelling will bring strength, not sulk. The engineer checks angles with a knowing squint. The mason stands at the abutment and listens for the mutter of honest load. On the bank, the girl, suddenly taller than last year's questions, holds the chalked plan and does the arithmetic of gratitude without paper. The first test is sandbags and humour. The second is a donkey who refuses to be impressed. The third is a wagon of grain and 4 children who are told to walk and do anyway. When the deck answers with a note everyone likes, the captain nods as if someone has just returned something important. In the square, the printer's press chews out a single-page broadside. Bridge open, lock rules, revised, baker's weight unchanged, fire roots, summer, small joys, bread, blankets, babies, beans. Continue. Children carry the stack like bread. The watchmaker polishes the bell's spring note on a travel clock and sets it beside the example loaf. The clock and bread agree without meeting. The apothecary moves jars again, comfrey to the front for knees that forget humility. Vinegar for scrapes, rosewater for tempers, nettle tea for the stubborn tired. She takes an afternoon to walk the narrow lanes, where winter tucked loneliness into corners, knocks on 3 doors that haven't opened lately, and leaves, without commentary, a paper with instructions for sleep and soup. Some medicines are recipes with manners. At the Guildhall, a brief court writes small rules that will feel like kindness later. Children playing chalk games will have their grids respected until noon. Water sellers will bring an extra bucket to the old steps by the east wall. Apprentices may sit near the door in summer classes so the breeze can take its turn at teaching. The herald reads, the printer prints, the jester adds 1 sentence about a queen who learned to change a map by an inch, and the applause is the tidy kind that leaves benches where it found them. Down the lane, a rope walk hums like a loath-to thought. The rope maker lays new hemp into long, patient spirals while telling a boy how to judge a splice by ear. Trulay sings, greed rasps. He sends coils to the bridge crew, the barges, the wells, and one to the bell, because voices prefer honest company. The moneyer visits and taps the thumb notch on a fresh run of coins, then watches market women read weight with their fingers and feels unnecessary on purpose. A morning of celebration arrives without trumpets. Banners look like laundry, music looks like feet behaving together. The bridge crew walks the span with a donkey and a ledger. The baker pushes a cart to the middle and sells the first slice there because superstition likes a snack. The weavers tie a short strip of cloth where truss meets handrail and call it insurance. The girl who drew the bridge sets her palm on a brace and holds still until she can feel the load move through wood into stone. She smiles with the seriousness of craft, and then remembers to grin like a child. Beyond, fields knit themselves into green paragraphs. The gardener's beans climb with the cheerful ignorance of plants. The willow stakes she was careless with are leafing into small decisions that will be shade by midsummer. Marigolds, once dried suns on a winter wall, sprout from paper packets and begin again. Children chalk 2 hopscotch grids at the crossroads and add a third around the corners, because redundancy is a game first and a policy later. At Knossos, light drops like a sentence into a stairwell that has practiced being surprised for 3,000 years. A guide slows a group at the light well and says nothing intelligent for a whole minute, which is the correct amount of scholarship when Stone is speaking. A child, season's cold finally gone from her nose, whispers stay to a dolphin, and the guide quietly repeats it to the drain. The conservator notes a hairline crack, adds a dab of lime like a kindness, and records, spring breath, steady. In the shop that smells of oil and mint, the man who learned ladders more than daggers sands a plain sole until it loses argument with wood. He refuses coin from a young carpenter making shelves for a room that will be books. He takes instead a promise to return a borrowed saw and puts a pebble in the ledger to mark it. He waters beans, watches bees investigate marigold seedlings, and decides to learn the names of 3 birds by sound. Quiet can be industrious. The judge walks the canal and checks that the fourth toll is still a rumour and the second lantern still lit. A ferryman shows 2 new hands the knot that promises to fail kindly. If you can untie it wet, he says, you will forgive yourself faster. They practice until forgiveness becomes technique. The lockkeeper, seeing the bridge, salutes with a paddle. The engineer answers with a string line. The mason taps stone and hears approval. Evening brings a fare that remembers how to be modest. The cooper's drum lids, listening for vowels. The smith shows a hinge that behaves like a courtesy. The watchmaker tunes a wheel of wooden toys to frequencies that keep arguments from echoing indoors. The printer sells maps drawn large enough for walking. The jester tells a very short story about a queen who sharpened mercy until it cut cleaner than rage, and the baker claps like a man finally relieved of a burden no one else could see. Signals climb the ridge in perfect weather purely for joy. Small joy, bridge open, homecomings, plural. Boys grin at the choreography of light and air. Down in the square, the bell takes the hour and makes it sound like permission. The frogs in the ditch pick up their mathematics where last year left it, and a dog relearns that geese answer to no one. Night turns up soft as a practiced page. The quartermaster scratches a line across a list because there is nothing to add. The apothecary rinses her kettle and leaves it upside down to dry. The water clock in the monastery throat ticks like a light footstep. The watchmaker opens a window to let spring draught argue with dust. On the bridge, the braces settle. On the wall, the patches keep their promises. On the river, a barge nudges a gate and says please in wood. The gate, relieved to be needed, says yes. If you want one last scene before sleep, walk to the middle of the span when the street lamps have decided their circles and the river is in the mood to listen. A fiddler plays something that knows about walking home. The girl who drew the bridge leans her shoulder against a post and tries the line she's been saving on her tongue. Prevailing is not the same as permanent, and finds that tonight it tastes like pride without swagger. Far away, in a ruin that taught corridors to breathe, dolphins keep swimming. Nearer, in a lane that used to rehearse fear, marigolds unfold their small suns. The thread settles across your palm like a sensible promise. You can tug again tomorrow, to hayfields and harvest, to summer shade and city fountains, to pilots reading river in moonlight, to presses that teach gossip to behave. Or you can let it rest and trust that craft will keep the night stitched to the morning. The lesson keeps its shape because it is built like a bridge. Craft beats weather. Fairness likes to be written down. Water respects persuasion. Stone answers attention. Myths borrow roofs from buildings that breathe, and mercy, late or on time, still chooses to appear. Set the thread by the lamp. In the morning it will be warm with ordinary light, ready to lead you exactly as far as the day requires. No farther, no less. Pick up the thread and it carries you into high summer, when streets smell faintly of stone baked honest and shade is a currency traded without ledger. The quartermaster writes a deceptively simple line at the top of his board. Water, shade, salt, sleep, and after a beat adds silence at noon. The rule isn't moral, it's mechanical. Heat makes tempers brittle, quiet keeps them from snapping. Down by the river, the lockkeeper leans on his paddle and watches light break into coins on current. A boy asks if the water is richer on bright days. Only in rumours, the man says, then shows him how to read the scumline on the masonry, to know if it's a good hour to lift or wait. On the towpath, flags nap. The signaller teaches a midsummer shorthand, 2 tight cuts for close the paddles, a lazy sweep for let it settle, and a jaunty tick that means someone's singing on the barge, do not compete. At the far quay, a lighthouse opens its glass eye for the first time. The watchmaker has balanced the clockwork that turns its lens like a patient planet. The glassmaker has ground prisms that gather one flame into many obedient arguments. The ropemaker has given a cord that won't sulk in salt. They light the wick. Night, when it sums, will learn a new grammar. Long, short, turn, long, short, turn, a meter Sheps can memorize and steer by. A child asks if the light gets tired. We do, the keeper says and grins, so we take turns. In the square, a fountain returns to work with a voice that persuades everyone to organise their afternoons around it. Children ferry cups. A woman in a blue kerchief sets a basket beneath the spout and washes apricots as if polishing small suns. The moneyer buys 2 and pays with a coin whose notch has become a habit more than a warning. The printer posts a fresh sheet, lighthouse pattern, heat rules, fire routes, summer, guild seals verified, small joys continue, and a scribble at the bottom that isn't policy but is permission. If you can lend shade, do. The apothecary writes summer's briefest prescription on the door: air, water, salt, patience, and spends the afternoon teaching the market boys to brew vinegar sherbet in barrels that stay in the shade. She ties cloth over spigots and says, "Flies prefer gossip to facts." A soldier arrives with a headache that speaks fluent trumpet. She sits him under a lintel where wind remembers its job and gives him a cup that tastes like survival with manners. He leaves slower than he arrived. This is success. At the new bridge, a donkey teaches a class on structural confidence by refusing to panic when a cart rattles. The engineer listens for the note in the timber that means summer expansion is behaving. The mason checks the abutment with both palms like a man greeting a friend. The girl who drew the plan taps the rail twice, a private superstition that sounds like gratitude, and walks on. Beneath, water rehearses the autumn it will demand. Across town, the old siege park is a farm entire. The last trebuchet axle became a beam in a granary that breathes through slats. Its iron shoes now anchor a windlass at the well. Its sling lives many small lives as bucket straps and bookbindings. A tinker sells copper rivets by handfuls and pays for his stall with a blanket corner stitched with a weaver's seal. "Good work," he says to the square in general. "Protects more than backs." No one argues. The Guildhall opens its shutters wide and writes 3 small ordinances that will be mistaken for courtesies when they are in fact engineering. Carts will pause at corners to let shade cross first. Water carriers will share a cup with any door that flew open during winter alarms. The bell will keep to hour, not alarm, unless told otherwise by smoke, flags or children. The herald reads, the printer prints, the jester tells a single sentence about a queen who chose verbs like keys. Applause behaves. Knossos wears heat like a calm medal. Light wells hoard cool air. Corridors borrow sky, drains remember. A guide stands a group beneath a staircase that doesn't hurry and says nothing for the length of a sensibly peeled orange. The silence teaches more than adjectives. A child whispers stay to a painted dolphin. A conservator answers by touching a hairline with lime the way one touches the sleeping wrist to check a pulse. Blue keeps being blue without needing anyone's approval. Evening drifts in on sandals. A festival decides to be modest. Bread cut in squares, cheese that argues politely with apricots, a jug of minted water that forgets how to be lukewarm. The watchmaker tunes a wheel of wooden toys to pitches that keep rooms from echoing. The smith demonstrates a hinge that chooses courtesy. The coopers drum lids and listen for vowels. The weavers hang a shade cloth over the chess table and call it civic harmony. The baker sells the example loaf at cost and writes the chalk mark for kindness on a bag he pretends belongs to no one in particular. The moneyer watches market women test the notch with their thumbs, and happily unneeded, claps along to a tune the jester insists he didn't invent. Night at sea begins to trust the lighthouse. 3 ships blink acknowledgements, long, long, short, and the keeper, who said light tires, sits and watches the lens blink back at the world with a self-esteem earned by gears, glass, rope, and patience. On shore, the signaller takes the ridge at dusk and drills the boys in homecomings, plural because a cousin's cart has a new wheel and a fiddle, and repeating joy is free. A small emergency visits and leaves politely. A kitchen cold plays traveller. A neighbour notices the wrong flicker through a shutter. The printed summer roots prove they weren't merely handsome. The watcher's boredom stays excellent. Steam wins. In the morning, the sweep bangs his brush against a boot like a drum. The apothecary sends honey. The baker doubles heels. The judge writes nothing, which reads like satisfaction. The shop that smells of oil and mint performs 3 quiet kindnesses. A hinge oiled before it squeaks. A saw returned without being asked. A paper packet labelled string. Spare slipped into a basket that didn't pay enough coin. The man who learned ladders glances at the old coin in the ledger and feels nothing but metal. He waters beans and learns the first of his birds by sound. Names arrive more slowly than seeds and last longer. The school moves outside until noon quiet claims the yard. The teacher draws the lighthouse pattern in dust, long, long short, and tells the children that some signals are for everyone and some are for 2 people across a room. She points at the bell tower. That one's for all. This, she taps the dust, could be for you. The girl who drew a bridge sketches a shaded walk along the south wall. The boy with knots shows a loop a tired hand can untie. The teacher writes the same word under both. Good. Up the canal, a judge rides at twilight with a clerk and checks lanterns, tolls and tempers. They pass 2 ferrymen teaching a new hand the promise knot that fails kindly. If you can untie it with wet fingers in the dark, one says, you've already forgiven yourself. The clerk grins and adds no fourth toll to his book with visible pleasure. Autumn rehearses at the edges of fields. The gardener lays straw under first melons. Marigolds stand like small lanterns. Bean vines mutter in leaves. Children chalk 2 hopscotch grids and a spare. Redundancy has become a game that children win by drawing before failure needs to. The printer's newest sheet reads less like law and more like a mirror. Lighthouse pattern. Bridge proofed. Weights and measures unchanged. Fire routes summer, shade ordnance. Small joys continue. A scribble at the bottom, bring back baskets, the star means we noticed when you do. On a hill where the wind keeps its manners, a boy with a flag practices the chevron for bridge-proof tomorrow, even though the bridge is already open. He likes how the shape feels in his shoulders. Practice is its own festival. The signaller lets him send homecomings, plural, just because the evening deserves it. Down in the square, the bell makes an hour that sounds like permission. A fiddler finds a tune that knows how to walk people home. The Coopers drum a lid in perfect D, or maybe C, depending on who's listening. Night collects the day without arguments. The quartermaster scratches silence at noon from the board, because everyone has learned it anyway. The lighthouse writes its calm sentence on darkness. The lock gate sleeps with weight in its hinges, and wakes when a barge says please. The wall keeps its patches like good decisions kept. Canossos breathes. The bean vines grip what they can reach. The marigolds, pleased with themselves, do not apologise for thriving. If you want one last thing before sleep, watch the keeper trim the wick and the lens turn that small flame into a map you can see from miles away. Consider how many hands stand behind that quiet beam. Glass ground by a man who liked patience more than compliments. Rope laid by someone who listens for true. Iron filed by a smith who trusts anger less than timing. A clock tuned by a watchmaker who believes minutes can be persuaded. A printed sheet that made the pattern common knowledge. A child who decided to memorize it. That is how safety is built, not by awe, but by agreements. You can tug the thread again tomorrow, to great presses that teach feet to be careful, to granaries that breathe without inviting rats, to autumn fairs where mathematics and mercy share a bench, to storm nights when the lighthouse keeps its pulse while men keep theirs, or you can let it lay soft beside the lamp and trust habit to carry the dark to morning. The lesson holds because it keeps being true. Craft beats weather. Fairness likes to be written down. Water respects persuasion. Stone answers attention. Myths borrow roofs from buildings that breathe. And mercy, late or on time, still chooses to appear. Set the thread where your hand will find it. Morning will warm it, and the day will unfold exactly as far as needed, no farther, no less. Lift the thread one last time, and it brings you to an evening that looks like a kept promise. The river is level as a thought that's been argued kindly. The bridge wears its work like a well-fitted coat. The lock gate says yes in wood and iron without making a speech. The lighthouse turns its calm sentence on the horizon. Long, long, short. Turn, and ships you will never meet answer by adjusting their minds a few degrees towards safety. In the square, the fountain keeps its cool voice. The baker sets out the example loaf beside the printed weight, and the chalk mark for kindness waits on an empty sack like a door held open. Nothing dramatic happens. That is the achievement. Walk it once more, past the rope walk where true lay still sings, past the bell that learned to prefer hours to alarms and taught the choir to enter on the third swing, past the smith who trusts timing more than temper, and warms his hands over a hinge that answers yes, past the printer who turned gossip into public paper and pinned up maps large enough to walk, past the moneyer's notch that let thumbs read truth by habit, past the weaver's seal stitched small into the corner of blankets that are really policies that learn to be warm, past the coopers who drum lids and listen for vowels, past the apothecary door that still carries the season's short prescription, air, water, salt, patience, and a note that says we will knock, past the watchmaker who persuaded minutes and then taught lamps and lighthouses to keep company with them without sulking, past the teacher's window where triangles became trusses and a sentence, prevailing is not the same as permanent, stayed on the wall until it turned into manners, past the guild hall where ordinances were just courtesies with ink, and where a jester told stories about a queen who sharpened mercy until it cut cleaner than rage. Climb the ridge where flags learn to be language. The boys, taller now, can send homecomings without looking at their hands. They sweep the air with a pattern that the hill remembers, and below, doors open because they can. The signaller lets them send it twice, not for need but for pleasure, and the bell in the town catches the hour, as if applause had learned to keep time. Down at the canal, A ferryman ties the promise knot for a new pair of hands, then makes them untie it wet. If you can forgive yourself in the dark, he says, you're already halfway home. The clerk riding with the judge writes nothing about a fourth toll because there isn't one. His empty line is a kind of satisfaction. Go farther. Back to the ruin that taught corridors to breathe. The guide stands a group beneath a staircase and measures a minute with silence. A child whose nose is no longer pink but sun-browned whispers "stay" to a painted dolphin. A conservator touches a hairline with lime like a pulse and records, breath steady. Wind threads the light well, drains remember their job, blue keeps being blue without asking permission. Myth, given a roof that knows how to shed rain, remembers how to be gentler than fear. Return by the lane where a shop smells of oil and mint. The man who learned ladders more than daggers sands the sole of a plane until wood stops complaining. He sharpens a hook knife, labels a small packet string spare, and slides it into a basket that didn't pay enough. He waters beans climbing willow that rooted by accident and refused to be corrected. Along the rafters hang marigolds, last year's small suns drying into seed for next year's lamps. He glances at the old coin in his ledger and feels only metal, nothing more. Pebbles mark favours owed and forgiven. Forgetting, properly arranged, has become housekeeping. Evening collects the day without argument. The quartermaster's board is down to nouns that have become customs. Water, shade, salt, sleep. The schoolyard hopscotch has 2 redundancies and a spare. Boots will erase it by noon tomorrow, and children will redraw it because policy learned itself as a game. The frog song returns to the ditch, arithmetic with a melody. Geese offer editorials and are ignored. The market winds itself into smaller circles. A wheel of toys tuned to keep rooms from echoing. Hinges choosing courtesy. Blankets promising winter they will attend. A printed sheet that says almost nothing new, and therefore everything useful. Weights and measures unchanged. Fire routes, lock rules, lighthouse pattern, small joys continue. A small emergency tries to audition, an ember, a crackle, a flicker through a shutter, and is met by boredom practiced into excellence. Buckets go where printed routes said they would. Steam wins as if it had rehearsed. Honey arrives, extra heels appear in a bag with a tiny star. The judge writes nothing. This too is theatre, the kind that sends everyone home with the quiet belief that tomorrow will behave. Stand once more in the middle of the span, lean your shoulder to the rail, feel load hum through timber into stone, all the way down to river and bed. You're inside the arithmetic of agreements. Glass, rope, iron, lime, ink, coin, bread, flags, stories. A lighthouse turns a single flame into the geography. A bell adds hour to hour without waking babies. A lock gate negotiates with water instead of trying to win. A city chooses to remember things that look like chores until they look like peace. The girl who drew the bridge taps the rail twice. A superstition turned ritual, ritual turned gratitude, and smiles without swagger. The engineer says nothing, because nothing is the correct tribute to a structure that's doing its job. The mason rests both palms on stone and hears contentment. If you need a moral, take the one the whole year kept teaching until it learned to say itself. Craft beats weather. Fairness likes to be written down. Water respects persuasion. Stone answers attention. Myths borrow roofs from buildings that breathe. And mercy, late or on time, still chooses to appear. If you need a map, follow the printed sheet that changes only when honesty does. If you need a blessing, borrow the lighthouse pattern. Long, long, short turn. Adjust a few degrees. Arrive. Now set the thread down. Lay it beside the lamp where your hand will find it in the morning, warm with ordinary light. The bell will choose hour, the bridge will keep its note. The lock will say yes without theatrics. The lighthouse will write its patient sentence on the dark, while ships you don't know steer kinder. Knossos will breathe, the drains will remember, the blue will continue. The shop latch will answer yes. The marigolds will go on being small suns. The beans will climb because that is their only ambition. Sleep in a town that learned to make safety out of agreements. When you wake, the path will ask very little of you. Just enough attention to keep things true, just enough kindness to keep them gentle. And if sometime you forget the way, listen. Long, long, short turn. So where does tonight leave us? With a few simple, unglamorous truths. Being a medieval assassin wasn't sleek or cinematic. It was cold hands, empty pockets, and odds so bad you measured success in heartbeats, not in glory. No training montage, no secret guild, no pension, just a dangerous errand run on borrowed luck. If there's a moral there, it's this. The farther you get from the costume, the closer you get to the cost. Olympus? Not a cartoon villain or a saint with snakes. She was a strategist in a world that punished hesitation. She treated belief as a weapon and motherhood as a mandate. When she chose, people lived or didn't. You don't have to approve to understand the landscape. Palaces as pressure cookers, omens as policy, mercy as a luxury nobody budgeted for. That's the uncomfortable gravity of power. Someone pays, and history rarely lists the cashier. Knossos reminded us that myths don't need monsters to be real. Sometimes a labyrinth is just a building that breathes, with drains that work and corridors that refuse to walk in straight lines. Bulls on the walls, light in the wells, a floor plan that disorients on purpose, no thread needed, just the willingness to slow down. When architecture makes you feel small and curious at the same time, story rushes in to finish the sentence. And siege engines, the original loud ideas. Rams, towers, catapults, trebuchets. Physics with a temper and a purpose. They broke stone, but more importantly they broke confidence. Then gunpowder arrived and redrew the rules, and eventually we traded moats and merlons for firewalls and blockades. Same playbook, new props, patience, pressure, psychology. Walls fall when minds do. Zoom out and the pattern is boring in the best way. Plans beat panic, logistics beat legend. The people who keep water clean, rope sound, hinges kind, and time honest are the reason anyone gets a sunrise. That never makes the chronicle, but it always makes the difference. So if you're listening with the lights low and the fan murmuring, here's your final thought for the pillow. History isn't a parade of heroes and monsters. It's a long negotiation between what we imagine and what the world will actually let us build. Assassins fade because risk does not love names. Queens endure because consequences keep receipts. Palaces crumble, but a good drain can outlast a dynasty. Siege engines retire, the laws of motion stay employed. Take a breath, unclench your jaw, wherever you are. On a couch, in a dorm, under a roof that creaks a little when it rains, you made it to the end. If tonight's tour knocked some shine off the myths and left something steadier in its place, that's the win. We'll pick up another thread next time. Different century, same human fingerprints. For now, let the room go quiet. Let the clock be gentle. Let the worries step outside for air without you. Close your eyes. Good night.